Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OTD Military History. Today, we are going to be going over another topic that I've done quite a little bit on over the last couple of years. Had today's guest on to talk about this topic in the past. Just talking about how I've spent literally all of today and the past little bit working on videos about this particular battle, the Battle of Ortona. So I just want to let everyone know I am working on some stuff for the Battle of Ortona because I did visit there in the spring. So I've got lots of cool stuff. So I'm working on something that I'm hoping to get out in the next little bit, right, with the anniversary of the battle coming up. But things will be going to the patrons and YouTube channel members first and things like that. And we may have to look at doing some stuff in the new year. So that being said, stuff is coming. It's just, there's a lot, as it's a lot of you know, there's a lot to this story. And today's guest, we were talking about this 2 years ago now. Talking to Jayson Geroux on, a couple weeks ago, talking about the Battle of Hue. So we're having him on again to talk about Ortona, which he has discussed in the past. Except he's going to be using some of that new technology that he had at the Battle of Hue presentation we did a couple weeks ago that everyone seemed to enjoy. So let's get into it. Hey, Jayson, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me back.
Oh yeah, no, you're always welcome to come on the channel, especially to talk about Ortona. A really, really fascinating one for me. Obviously, with the amount of work and time I went there, so it's a fascinating one to look at. So, can you just tell us? I think you got to get the screen up though for your presentation.
I will indeed.
Don't see it there. You got to share it. We'll do that. But while you're doing that, just give it a thought of kind of what else you're going to be bringing for us today, because your last presentation was really well viewed and very well done. I've been watching it again, to steal more of your knowledge without you knowing, to kind of, get through some of the details. But just wondering kind of, you can give us a quick overview before we start of what else you're going to be bringing for us today.
Yeah, certainly. Can you see my presentation there, Brad? Good to go?
Yeah, I'm waiting to get that answer ready first before I put it up there.
Okay. Well, actually, the answer is in the next couple of slides in the introduction of my presentation. So if you can throw my presentation up, then I'll be able to actually answer that question.
Well, there we go.
Okay. So, Brad, again, I've been in the Canadian Armed Forces for 29 years, and so I always follow the CAF format for presentations. You see the 4 cardinal points there, and then we go into the main teacher points and as part of my introduction. And first of all, thanks again for having me back to do this. When we did this 2 years ago, Brad, I don't know if you remember, but I think you were just getting over a cold and I had COVID. And
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. And the positive thing, if there is a positive thing about having COVID, was my voice was considerably deeper and more sultry. But the challenging thing was that when I watched the presentation afterwards, I was clearing my throat every 30 seconds, which was really incredibly annoying. So thankfully, I think you don't have a cold and I don't have COVID this time. So we'll be able to give the viewers a better show.
There we go.
So as part of my introduction, Brad, I'm not going to go through this slide. Remember this slide from our discussion of the Battle of Hue?
Yep.
This is my CV, my resume when it comes to urban operations. I don't want to go through this line by line like I did for the Battle of Hue because, in all honesty, if you want to know what I've been doing for the past 23 years, please go to Brad's and my discussion of the Battle of Hue, where I go through this line by line, and you can see. But basically, for the past 23 years, I've had lots of professional, personal, practical, instructional, academic, historical, doctrinal, urban operations experience, knowledge, and writing. The first 10 years, it was all the individual skills, learning how to clear rooms. And then after I was involved in the urban battle of Kabul and Afghanistan in 2012, I decided I have to elevate and start understanding urban operations planning, tactics, and sustainment from the company, battalion, brigade, division levels. And that's what I've been doing for the past 12 years. Now I go all over the world teaching urban operations and urban warfare history. And I think I'll just leave that slide at that. Again, if you want the more details, please go to our Hue presentation. I go through that line by line. I'm almost there, Brad, to answer your question. In the military, of course, when we write a set of operational orders, we have a concept of operations paragraph. And I like to do that because I find it sets the context of the presentation. So the intent is what I'm going to do, have OTD Canadian Military History members become more knowledgeable about the Battle of Ortona in particular and about urban operations in general, because I'm an urban operations instructor and an urban warfare historian. The scheme of maneuver is how I'm going to do it. So I have a number of mapping programs, videos, photos, and the PowerPoint to discuss the key points and takeaways. And scheme of maneuver is always broken down into phases. I have 4 phases. Phase 1 is really the first few of the main teaching points, what I call shaping operations, so everybody understands the background, the context of the battle, and why it happened. And then phase 2 is the urban battle itself. Phase 3, the post-battle events. And phase 4, a conclusion and question period. A main effort is usually a unit or an activity or a phase that has to receive the majority of the resources in order for the mission to be successful. So in this case, my main effort, a majority of the presentation is going to be talking about the urban battle of Ortona itself. And the end state, you get to walk away knowing a little more about the urban battle of Ortona in particular, and about urban operations and some of the challenges, complexities, and necessities of urban warfare. All right, so Brad, now I'll finally answer your question. Why are we doing this again after 2 years? Well, these are my resources, and my master's thesis on the Battle of Ortona, which was published in September 2020, under the tutelage of the fantastic and slightly loopy Dr. Lee Windsor and his absolutely lovely wife, Dr. Cindy Brown, who are very much subject matter experts on Canada and the Italian campaign. So I was able to do my master's thesis under them. But since then, over the past 2 years, there's been new historical evidence that's been uncovered. And that was largely because of Dr. Windsor himself. When we were approached by Gregory Fremont Barnes, he was writing a book called Urban Battlefields. He asked Lee and I to write a chapter on Ortona, and Lee was able to dive into more primary resources and the intelligence logs and the communications logs in particular to find out more information about the fighting, not only inside of Ortona, but outside west of Ortona as well. And so Lee and I wrote that chapter with all this new evidence. And that's the reason why, we're back here again today, because I'm going to be able to talk about some of that new information that Lee found. And then when we wrote the chapter, it was published in Urban Battlefields. And from that, we were able to segue into a great podcast run by a very young American lady named Sasha, who runs the Mother of Tanks podcast. And Lee and I were able to do a 2-part podcast on the Battle of Ortona with her. And then the United States Army University Press contacted me and asked me to be a part of their documentary on the Battle of Ortona, and they've done some fantastic work and uncovered some new evidence and have a great video that you can find here on YouTube as well. And then, of course, there's Brad and my work from 2 years ago. And so this is the reason why, Brad and I were talking about coming back and doing the show again, so that because of the new historical evidence that's been found and some of the great footage that's now located online. Is that a good answer for you, Brad? Are we good to go?
That's a perfect answer. Yep.
All right, cool. Good to go. All right. So I will put my military historian hat on, and, why Ortona back in 2017, when I was talking to Dr. Windsor, why Ortona? Well, yeah, of course, Jayson picked Ortona because he's an urban operations instructor, an urban warfare historian. It actually wasn't that easy. I was also talking to Lee maybe about doing my thesis on my grandfather's unit. As you know, Brad, from our discussion of the Battle of Hue, my maternal grandfather was a U.S. Marine in the Second World War. And I thought maybe I should, in honor of my grandfather, I should do my thesis on his unit and what it went through in the Pacific Theater of the campaign. But something kept drawing me back to Ortona. Maybe it's because I'm Canadian. Maybe it's because I'm an urban operations instructor and I'm an urban warfare historian. And I felt that, when I had read anything on Ortona, there was always something missing. I was missing the big picture as to what happened during the battle. And so finally I decided when I started doing my master's thesis with Dr. Windsor and Dr. Brown, I finally decided Ortona had to be what I had to research the most. And when I was doing my initial research, I had 5 surprises. The first one was that it seemed that historians, whenever they wrote about Ortona, they would just barf out a bunch of individual stories. Major What's-His-Pickle did this on this day, and Sergeant What's-His-Pickle 2 did that on this day, and then Corporal What's-His-Pickle 3 did that. And there was no rhyme or reason to the battle. It was just, we'll barf out a bunch of individual stories, and that's the Battle of Ortona. And what that led to was other historians doing the same thing. And I remember the second research surprise was a historian saying, a day-by-day accounting of the battle cannot be done. And I was like, challenge accepted, right? And I was like, no, I think a day-by-day accounting of the battle can be done. And the third research surprise that I found was that some military historians didn't understand military context or the military reasoning as to why things were done. There was a couple military historians, for example, who said Ortona could have been bypassed, and the Canadians just could have bypassed the city and carried on with the fight. And I think at the end of this presentation, you'll agree that no, it can't be bypassed. there's no really good understanding or reason why the Germans defended Ortona was another thing I saw. And I'm like, wow, you clearly don't understand the battle that well, or why there's actually very good reasons why the Germans decided to defend in Ortona. And we'll talk about those later on. There was no cause and effect. This was the fourth research surprise. Again, I wasn't getting a holistic view of the battle, right? I was just getting, here's a bunch of individual stories, and you don't understand why things are happening, or why did the Germans do this and why did the Canadians do that? And so I wanted to see if that cause and effect was actually there. And then finally, there were some historians I found who were blind to the military's institutional process. They would certainly say things, and I would be like, wow, it's clear to me you don't understand. You're a military historian, but you don't understand how the military works, like some of the institutional processes as to why things are certainly done. And so after doing this initial research, I went back to Lee and I said, yeah, I want to do Ortona, and this is what I've done. And so we dove into it. And I found that too, that most historians tended to follow what I call the formula. Now, you go to Colonel Nicholson's official history of the Canadians in the Italian campaign, and I would find that most historians would emulate Colonel Nicholson, in which they would do 2/3 of the Ortona chapter was on the fighting at the Moa River and the Gully.
Yep.
And then the final third was on the fighting inside Ortona itself, and we'll just barf out a bunch of individual stories. And so I wanted to flip that formula around, being an urban warfare historian. I wanted to flip that formula around and go, no, I want to focus on the fighting inside the city and not touch the Moa River and the Gully. That's already been done to death. And focus on the fighting inside the city itself, and maybe a little about the fighting to the west of the city. But let's focus on the urban fighting itself. So after I and there's one thing too, I found that there was little discussion on the Germans. There was little discussion on the geography in and around Ortona, like the urban terrain itself, the weapons and the effects. And there was very little discussions on the civilians that were inside the city and what they suffered through as well. So after I did all this initial research, excuse me, Lee was like, okay, Jay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to do a holistic view of the battle. You're going to do it at the brigade and the battalion level. You're not going to talk about the individual stories because everybody's done that already. So go off and do great things. And I'm like, yeah, Lee, that's right. That's what we're going to do. And then I completely ignored everything he said, and I just wrote whatever I wanted to write. And I was a typical graduate student there, Brad. I was like, I am going to write the defining history on this particular battle. Like that was my graduate student mindset.
Yep.
And I remember when I finished my first draft, and I remember telephoning Lee, and he was in his car waiting for Cindy to finish an appointment. And Lee's like, how many pages did you write? And I'm like, 261 pages for the first draft of my thesis. And the University of New Brunswick guidelines where you had to go maximum 200 pages. That was all. And this is a fairly formal presentation, so I won't repeat the more than justifiable profanity that came out of Lee's mouth on the other side of that telephone. But he's like, all right, Jay, we're going to have to cut it down to less than 200 pages because that's UNB guidelines. And I'm like, oh, all right, Lee, I guess we'll have to murder my children a bit, which is what we all historians have to do, right? When it comes to whatever we produce and write. And so I ended up cutting out a chapter, and this is what's missing from my thesis is I had a complete chapter on the weapons and the weapons effects. But Lee was like, you're putting the cart before the horse. You're talking about things that happened during the battle before you're talking about the battle. So, Jay, I get it that you're an urban operations instructor and that soldiers who read this thesis will want to know about that stuff. But what we can do is incorporate, the weapons and the weapons effects into the larger picture of the battle, please. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. And the other thing that's missing is sustainment. I'm big on sustainment, Brad, as you know, amateur stock tactics, professional stock logistics. But a lot of the resources did not talk about how this battle was sustained. How did the Canadians get the bullets and the beans up to the front and the casualties to the rear? So that's what's missing from my thesis as well. All right, let's go into the Germans. As you know, Brad, that's my go-to joke. The Green Devils, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the 1st Parachute Division. Whenever we write a set of operational orders, we always talk about the enemy first. In this particular case, the Green Devils, allegedly called that by Sir Winston Churchill himself, the 1st Parachute Division. So let's talk about them. Okay, Brad, whenever we give operational orders to our subordinates and we lay down a map or a sand model, we always point out which direction north is in. So you see the top right of the screen. North is always at the top of my screen. at the top of your screens throughout this presentation. I say that now so that whenever a map comes up, I don't default to my setting of always pointing out where north is. And I find it's important as an urban warfare historian that I have to talk about the geographic terrain at the strategic and the operational and tactical levels. So this way, readers and viewers can understand the ground that the troops are actually fighting through in order for them to understand the battle that much better. So let's go to the strategic level, and you can see that map of Italy there. And of course, down the middle of the Italian boot are the Apennine Mountains. And over the centuries, the snow in the winter gathers up on the mountains. And then in the spring, you've got the melt and you've got the spring rains that that run off the mountain, and they form these beautiful deep valleys that go out to the Tyrrhenian Sea and the Adriatic Sea. And that's really great if you're a tourist, but it really sucks if you're in the military and you have to fight through all these very deep valleys because they act as natural obstacles. And what happens is at the strategic level, the Germans take advantage of all those deep valleys, and they add human-made obstacles to the deep valleys themselves to make those valleys even more formidable to cross. And so as the Allies are working their way up the country of Italy, with the Americans in the southwest and the British and the Canadians and the other Commonwealth countries in the northeast part of the country, as they're making their way up, the Germans form a number of defensive lines all the way up the Italian boot, and they name those defensive lines as you go further north. And for this one, for this particular battle, it is the Gustav line, which concerns us. And Brad, you can see I've circled with a red circle there, and there's a black dot. Do you know what that happens to be?
I sure hope that's Rome.
That is Rome. Yeah, that is Rome right there. And this is why the Gustav line is so important. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Germany, says to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Smiling Albert, because he's always smiling in every photo that you see him in. He says that Hitler tells Kesselring that he has to stop the Allies at the Gustav line because they can't take Rome. Of course, by this point, Italy's been knocked out of the war, but Italy was the former partner of the Germans. And so if the Germans lose Rome, the capital city of the former country that was their partner, that's a huge political and symbolic and strategic loss. And if the Allies are able to take Rome, that is a huge political and symbolic and psychological victory for the Allies, right? And so Hitler wants to make sure that Smiling Albert does not allow the Allies to take Rome, which is why he must build the Gustav line, and he must stop the Allies at the Gustav line itself. Brad, I'm just going to pop out here to that mapping program.
Yep.
Okay, folks, I know you like to chat on the right side there, but you may wish to take your hands off the keyboard and go to the mouse and go up to the full screen mode on YouTube there for some of these graphics. But I'm going to zoom in, and you can see as I zoom in, you can see my map there, right, Brad?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So you see Ortona there in the bottom, to the bottom right corner, and then you see the town of Pescara, which is in the top left or top left center of the screen there. And to the Germans, there is a concern that if the Allies break through the Gustav line and they get up to Pescara, what they'll be able to do is they'll be able to turn left and then go through on this road, this highway that eventually goes into, what do you think, Brad? It goes into
I'm not sure. Rome. Yeah.
What's that?
I'm not sure. Rome, maybe.
Yes, it goes into Rome, right? So there's Pescara, and then the road that cuts through the Apennine Mountains into the east side of Rome. So in retrospect, you can say, well, the British Eighth Army is working its way up the east side of Italy. It would have been very difficult for them to cross the Apennine Mountains and get into Rome, but the Germans can't discount that as a possible course of action. So the Germans have this legitimate concern that if the British Eighth Army gets up to Pescara, they'll turn left and be able to get into Rome through the east. And that will, of course, allow for the fall of Rome to happen that much easier.
Yep.
Right. And so that is why the Gustav line has to be south of Pescara so that it stops the Germans it stops the Allies from getting up to Pescara itself.
Yeah, just to jump in real quick and also let you get your breath there for a second, is that's still really the only way to go across, because I've done it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Take the train from the way because to get to Ortona is not the easiest. It's not the biggest tourist destination, right? Especially for foreign tourists. So you have to go through Pescara to get to Ortona on the train. And
oh, really?
That's the only way across.
Okay.
I checked multiple times. I even thought about driving it, and I looked at it and went, nope, that's too much. So we're taking the train. So that's really the only way to cross. So these things still hold true, whether for military purposes or for vacations.
Right. Okay, cool. All right. Let's go down to the operational level now. Now, throughout the Sicily and Italian campaigns, it was very common for the Germans to hold in a town or village for about 24 to 48 hours. And they use these towns and cities and villages as delaying mechanisms, which allowed them to continue constructing their human-made obstacles back to those natural valleys throughout Sicily and Italy. And because they set this pattern of only holding cities, towns, villages for 24 to 48 hours, when the British Eighth Army is approaching Ortona and the First Canadian Infantry Division is thrown back into the front lines of the fighting, British Eighth Army tells the First Canadian Infantry Division the same thing. Ortona, right, the Germans are only going to hold it for 24 to 48 hours, and then they're going to pull back to the Arieli River, which we think is the eastern point of the Gustav line. And so this is what the Canadians are told. But in reality, what has happened is that the German 1st Parachute Division will take over Ortona. It's actually going to make Ortona the eastern anchor point of the Gustav line, as well as the small village of Villa Grande. And I'll explain the reasons for that once we get down to the tactical level. So now here we are at the tactical levels, the Germans and their defense plan. So in September of 1943, the Germans occupy in and around Ortona. It's the Wehrmacht, it's regular army units. And what they start doing is they start preparing Ortona and west of Ortona to be part of the Gustav line, preparing the defenses to be part of the Gustav line. First thing they do is destroy the port, because amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. They don't want the Allies to be able to use the port as a logistical way station. Now, the port itself is actually quite small back in 1943, and it probably wouldn't have been able to take a lot of tonnage anyway, but they still destroy the port regardless. And then from September to December of 1943, the Wehrmacht units start destroying Ortona as part of the defensive preparation. You can see in the middle there, the little triangles that are throughout the northern part of Ortona. They actually destroy buildings and allow the buildings to spill out onto the street to create these huge piles of rubble. And then they sow booby traps and improvised explosive devices within the rubble itself to add to the German defenses. So this is the scheme and maneuver phase 1, the planning and preparation of Ortona for its defense. And I love Charles Comfort. I think he's a great Canadian war artist there, Brad. I'm sure you agree. But this is Charles Comfort's painting, Via della Rosa, Ortona. And you can see here one of the secondary streets with all the rubble on it. Yep. Because the secondary streets are so narrow, the rubble really chokes up those secondary streets, which makes it very challenging for dismounted infantry and engineers to move through those streets. And you can actually see the 4 Canadian soldiers here at the bottom of the painting and how challenging that particular ground is. And it's quite impossible for tanks to move up those kinds of streets too. But just to give you an idea how extensive the rubbling program really is that the Germans have prepared within Ortona itself. Okay, phase 2 of the scheme maneuver, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Parachute Regiment will come in and do a relief in place from those regular Wehrmacht units. And then what they'll do is a perimeter force battle at the southern edge of the town. The Germans were really following defensive doctrine before it became defensive doctrine. So a perimeter force battle usually happens, at the edge of a town or at the edge of a unit's area of operations. And what the perimeter force battle does, it sucks the enemy, it sucks the attackers in, it identifies their axis of advance, identifies their main effort. Maybe you could attrit some of the enemy during this perimeter force battle itself. And because the Germans have rubbled most of the secondary streets, but they've left the main highway invitingly open, they want to draw and suck the Canadians up in phase 3 with a disruption force battle that brings the Canadians right up through the center of the town. And because human beings are inherently lazy, because we don't want to, because they figure the Canadians will not want to use the secondary streets because of all the rubble piles and booby traps and the improvised explosive device. If we leave the main highway free, we'll bring the Canadians right up to the town, and that's where phase 4 can kick in, where we'll do the main defensive area battle. And this is where we're going to stop the Canadians within the town itself. And then how they'll do that is at the 4 squares, the 4 northern squares, the 4 piazze at the northern end of the town itself. And I'll talk about those squares in detail in a moment. And then the location of the reserves is going to be at a railway tunnel at the north end of the town. And what they'll be able to do throughout the perimeter force battle, the disruption force battle, and the main defensive battle is they'll be able to feed those reserves in from the railway tunnel at the north end of the town. So that, and then finally, the main effort will be to stop the Canadians, destroy the Canadians within the town. And at the end state is, now that they've destroyed the Canadians and stopped them within the town, that adds to their part of the defense of the Gustav line. All right, so let's talk about the geographic and urban terrain, mostly in Ortona. Ortona is split into two. There's Old Town in the north and New Town in the south. Okay, there's a satellite view. Old Town, what distinguishes Old Town from New Town really is that in Old Town, the buildings are very closely packed and it's very dense urban terrain where the buildings stand very much shoulder to shoulder. Whereas in New Town, the buildings are larger, but they're fairly separated and the streets are a little wider. So that's what separates Old Town from New Town itself. There's steep contours, ravines, and cliffs. To the west of Ortona, there's a very large ravine that's about 50 to 75 meters in height, and it's almost impossible to scale. There's a large ditch or a fosso at the north end of Ortona. And then the east side of Ortona, there's a large cliff, very steep. It's about 50 to 75 meters in height.
Sorry, I'm laughing because I didn't realize Ortona doesn't have a taxi service if you take the train. And if you have luggage, you have to walk up the hill.
Oh, really?
Have your wife hate you by the end of it in the rain. Yeah, I learned that area pretty good.
Okay, all right, Shane. So not so good for military and tourists then, is what you're basically saying.
No, okay. Don't do that.
Okay, don't do that. All right. So, Brad, when I was in charge of the counter improvised explosive device cell at the tactics school down at Canadian Forces Base Gagetown, New Brunswick, I had Canadian Armed Forces geomatics technicians working for me, and they've got some great military mapping programs. Yeah. And one of them here is what you can do is you can draw a line, and it'll show you the contours and the different land heights that go across that particular ground. So what I've done here is I've drawn a blue line from this red arrow to this red arrow, and then it shows it shows the three-dimensional view here off to the left side. So you can see how Ortona sits on that plateau. It's got that large ravine to the left, it's got the fosso, and it has the cliffs to the right in the Adriatic Sea. And as you move down from north to south, you can see that ravine and those cliffs remain fairly sizable as we go down to the south end of the town too.
Yeah.
Right. Two great photos. There was a Canadian Army film and photo unit that happened to follow the Canadians into this fight, and so they were taking a number of photos, and you can see Bravo Company, the Seaforths on the left. You can see Ortona off in the distance now. It sits on that plateau along with the Adriatic just to its immediate east. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Adriatic Sea to the east and the north. The main service roads, the MSRs through the highway. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Loyal Eddies, are going to be using the roads that are outlined in red. And the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada will be using the roads that I've outlined in yellow. What I want to point out here is Highway 16. So Highway 16, if you go to Ortona now, Highway 16 is actually outside of the city. But if you go back in 1943, Highway 16 actually ran through Ortona. So, and it gets renamed as it goes through the town itself. So when Highway 16 enters Ortona from the south, it's the Corso Bianchi. And then it becomes the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, and then it becomes the Via Tripoli, and then it's renamed Highway 16 when it leaves the north end of the town again. Highway 16 is not only the 1st Canadian Infantry Division's main logistical route, it's also the British 8th Army's main logistical route, which is another good reason why the Canadians have to clear Ortona. They can't bypass it and just leave it, because amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. You need Highway 16 kept open so you can bring the bullets and the beans and the gasoline up to the fight, and the casualties can be brought to the back. Okay, the Piazze, the 5 squares within Ortona. Starting to the south, there's Piazza Vittoria. It's now called Piazza Porto Caderi now, but back then it was Piazza Vittoria. Off to the west, you have Piazza San Francesco, which is renamed Dead Horse Square by the Seaforth, so I'll explain why later on. Piazza Municipale, the Piazza Plebiscita, and the Piazza San Tommaso. And it's the Piazza San Francisco, Municipale, Plebiscita, and San Tommaso. That's the main defensive area. That's where the Germans want to stop the Canadians in this fight. Prominent buildings from south to the north. I'll start from the south because that's the direction the Canadians came in. The Pensione, which becomes renamed Johnson's House. I'll explain why we'll turn the battle. The Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople in the southwest. If you go up to Piazza San Francesco, in Dead Horse Square, there's a school, a hospital, and a cathedral, the Cathedral Santa Maria della Grazie. There's the town hall within the Piazza Municipale. the Cattedrale San Tommaso, and then finally the Castello, the castle. The castle will have no say in this battle whatsoever, largely because it's run down and it's on the verge of collapsing. All right. And then finally, there's a railway that comes up the west side of the ravine, and then there's a railway tunnel at the very north end, and then there's the railway, and then it comes out, and then it comes down the east side of Ortona itself. Why is all this important, Brad? Ortona is a defender's dream. It is a defender's dream. You have steep cliffs to the right in the Adriatic to the east, and you have that deep ravine to the west. Ortona sits on a plateau, which means the Canadians have no choice. They have to fight uphill into the town, and then they have to fight through the town, and they can't flank it. They can't flank it on the west or the east. And it's very dense urban terrain inside the town itself. So there's a very good reason why a German paratrooper division wants to fight in Ortona, because of these geographic and urban reasons. Okay, I'm going to pop out again there, Brad, and go back to our map F4 program. And again, folks, you might want to toggle the full screen mode as I go down and zoom in Ortona. And the great thing about this map F4 program, as you saw for the Battle of Hue there, Brad, is that once you get down close enough, it actually zips into a 3-dimensional mode. And what I'm going to do, Brad, is I'm going to add the ground elevation, so it gets more of a 3D pop to it. And I'm going to zoom out. But the great thing about this is the city will populate in a moment. And I'll zoom around to the east. But what it does show, Brad, very clearly is how Ortona sits on that plateau. You can see there's the cliffs right there, right? And as we move to the north end, we can look at it from the north. It's very distinguishable there. You can definitely see there's the Adriatic, there's the cliffs, and there's the ravine. This is a very modern day photo, or a modern day rendering of Ortona. So there's been a lot of new added buildings, but it still demonstrates how Ortona sits on that plateau quite well. So a lot of this stuff at the south end of the city is very new. But anyway, and now you can see too, here's Ortona's old town. You can see the density of the urban terrain and how the buildings are also very close together, shoulder to shoulder. And then when you go back down to this old new town, you can see it'll populate here in a moment. You can see the buildings are very much separated and larger and very much wider boulevards. Okay. What I'm also going to do, Brad, is I'm going to go to the U.S. Army University Press documentary. And Sarah Carlson was the producer of this, and she took an uncrewed aerial vehicle, a drone, to Ortona and did some fantastic footage of flying over the town or the city. So you can see, okay, so here we are now looking west towards the ravine. And I don't know why it suddenly did that. My apologies. Suddenly popped back on for some reason. We'll go back. Here we go. Yeah. Sorry about that. So now here we are. We're going to fly west over towards the ravine. And so there's the ravine located right there. Now here's the east side with the cliffs. And you can see how steep those cliffs are. There's no way you're going to be able to get up those cliffs there. This is Old Town. You can tell this is Old Town from the density of the urban terrain, how it's packed shoulder to shoulder. Here's the Castello. There's the Adriatic Sea and the cliffs off there. Here's coming in, you're looking south now, and this is the approach into Ortona from the south. This is Old Town. You can see by the narrowness of the alleyways and the density of the urban terrain, how everything stands shoulder to shoulder. There's the ravine off to the left. There's the cliffs off to the right again. And the Canadians can only come in from the south, which is what that white arrow represents there. And there's me making some funny faces. And here we go. There's Newtown. And then you're going to see there's a great view. Here's a great drone shot of Newtown. See, all the buildings are big, separated by wide boulevards. And then Old Town itself, where it's all very densely packed urban terrain. And there's a Piazza San Tommaso right there. And look how narrow those alleyways are. Some of those alleys, you can put out your arms and touch, building on both sides of the wall. There's the 5 Piazze. And you did do that?
I did do that.
There's the 5 Piazze. This is Piazza Municipale. Yep. You can see they're not big, but they're not small piazzas at all. And there's me making funny faces. All right, let's go back now. Cool. So now that everybody understands the geographic urban terrain and what the soldiers are going to be fighting through, we'll go to the Red Patch Devils, the Canadians. Brad, do you know why they're called the Red Patch Devils?
From the first patch from the First World War.
Yeah, actually, it was during the Battle of Hue in Sicily when the Canadians, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, take some German prisoners, and one German prisoner says, "We don't understand you Red Patch soldiers." Of course, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division has a red rectangle on the shoulders of their soldiers. We don't understand you Red Patch soldiers. Whenever we lay mortar fire down, everybody else just sits there and takes it, but the Red Patch soldiers get up and they run through the mortar fire and they attack our positions. You Red Patch soldiers are devils. And so the 1st Canadian Infantry Division nickname is born, the Red Patch Devils. And Brad, there's a delicious irony that the Green Devils are fighting the Red Patch Devils in the urban hell that is Ortona. Historians have jumped all over that, of course.
Yep.
All right. So Brad, I mentioned earlier, everybody else has talked about the Moore River and the Gully, and I'm not going to do that. Yep. But the effects of the fighting in the Moore River and the Gully, and historians have not been very kind to Major General Chris Vokes, the division commander, for how he handled the division for the fighting in the Moore River and the Gully. But the end result of that is that even though all 3 brigades, the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade, fight in the Moore River and the Gully, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade fares a little better. And so when it comes to actually taking Ortona, it's the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade that's going to be tasked with taking it. And it's led by Brigadier Bertram Hoffmeister, or Hoffy, who was accompanying a battalion commander in the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, and he becomes the brigade commander, and he'll eventually become the 5th Canadian Armored Division commander. And Brad, I'll die on this hill if you want, but I think Hoffy is the best senior officer that Canada ever produced in the Second World War.
Second World War. I was going to say ever.
Yes. So, but 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade at its core has 3 infantry regiments which have battalions within it. You have the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Loyal Eddies, obviously from Edmonton, Alberta. You have the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, Hoffy's old unit from Vancouver, British Columbia. And then you have Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the Patricias, which has always been a Western Canada unit. And some historians are like, oh, it was all Western Brigade, but it's not, because supporting 2 CIB in their fight for Ortona, we have the 12th Canadian Armored Regiment from Three Rivers, Trois-Rivières in Quebec. You have the Royal Canadian Engineers 4th Field Company. And then from New Brunswick, you have the Royal Canadian Artillery 90th Anti-Tank Battery, commanded by Major George Tiger Welsh. So even though some historians like to say, oh, it's an all-Western Canada brigade, I will suggest that it's an all-Canada brigade because it has all these other enablers and all these other units from other parts of Canada involved in the fight. So it's a cross-Canada fight for this. All right, 2 Canadian Infantry Brigade, they're caught up. So their intent, remember, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division has been told by British 8th Army, oh yeah, the Germans are only going to be there for the 24 to 48 hours, and then they're going to pull back to the area of the river because that's where the Gustav line is. So Hoffy has as his intent, he's going to clear the Germans out of Ortona. The scheme of maneuver, he's going to have 1 battalion just go up the main highway, Highway 16. He'll have the other 2 infantry battalions as right and left flank protection, respectively, and then he'll add the enablers when they so need it. First scheme for phase 1 of the scheme maneuver is planning and prep. Phase 2 is the clearing of Ortona. Phase 3 will be the reorganization and consolidation of the brigade before it moves up to the Arieli River to begin the fight for the Gustav line. The main effort will be the clearing of Ortona, and at the end state is that the brigade is set up and has helped to set up the division for success when it goes up to attack the Gustav line at the Arieli River. Groupings of tasks, the Loyal Eddies will get the task of clearing Ortona by going up Highway 16. The Seaforths will be right flank protection, and then the Patricias will also be left flank protection and the reserve battalion of the brigade. And then the Three Rivers Regiment, the Engineers, and the Royal Tank and the anti-tank 90th Anti-Tank Battery will provide support when needed. So that's the concept of operations and the groupings and tasks for 2 Brigade. All right, the Ortonesi. Excuse me. So, Brad, throughout my study of urban warfare history, I find that on average, about 10% of population will actually stay in a city, even though when they know an urban battle is coming. They don't want to leave because they have nowhere to go. They think they can protect their families by hiding in the basements, or the mean Canadians are going to steal all of my personal possessions, so I don't want to leave my house as a result. Ortona is no different. there's about 10,000 civilians within the town. The German Wehrmacht has actually evicted a majority of those civilians because they believe that if there's any civilians in the town, they will more than likely be spies, and they'll be able to tell the British and the Canadians what the Germans are up to. So they actually tell the Ortonesi in September of 1943, get out of the city, and if we find you here, we will execute you for being spies. And they, once about 9,000 of the 10,000 Ortonesi leave, and after that, the Germans get to work to destroy the town and rubble the town. And unfortunately, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, they do kill Ortonesi civilians within the town as they're blowing up all these buildings to make all these big rubble piles. But about 1,000 or so civilians estimated remain inside the town, even though they know this, even though they've been told by the Germans they have to leave, and even though they know this urban battle is coming. 1,000 of them are going to assume the risk and stay within the town itself. All right, I'm not going to take a health break. Normally when I give this presentation live, I do have a health break there, Brad, but this health break does give me a good chance to show you this photo that was taken of Ortona. You can see it's a considerably smaller town back in 1943, but this photo was taken just before the battle. All right, now we're ready for the battle itself. Okay. Are there any questions so far, Brad? I know I have a question period at the end, but have there been any questions?
No, nothing I haven't been able to handle, just little technical details of things like what are the buildings made out of, and they're all stone basically at the time. Okay,
good. All right, cool. Thank you. All right, so this map, of course, from Mark Zulke's Ortona, and what I'm going to do is go through it day by day for the next 8 days of the fighting. Now, I do realize, folks, that the writing on the bottom right of the screen is very, very small, and you probably can't see it. That's okay. If you bring up the full screen version on YouTube, you might be able to read it, but if not, that's okay. Those are really just placeholders for me to talk about the battle as we go through it. So we'll start off with the Loyal Edmonton Regiment on the left because they're the main effort. So Loyal Eddies are working their way up Highway 16 on the 20th of December. They've got D Company on the left side of Highway 16, B Company on the right, and they have a troop of tanks from Lieutenant Melvin's troop from the 3 Urs Regiment. And as they're working their way up Highway 16, there's a huge explosion. Lieutenant Melvin's tank actually drives over 50 pounds of TNT that have been buried into the Highway 16 itself, and it actually blows the tank up, flips it over, and the tank lands upside down, and it kills all 5 crew members, including Lieutenant Melvin itself. The other tanks in support of the Loyal Eddies actually go off-road because they think there could be other explosive devices on the road, and they run into a minefield and they get mired down in a minefield. And at that point, the Germans open up from the south end of Ortona and they start hitting the Loyal Eddies. So the Loyal Eddies don't have a good start as they're trying to work their way up to the south end of the town, and they end up putting fire down and stopping pretty much right there. On the right side, the C4th Islanders of Canada, remember, they're just providing right flank protection. And so their objective that day is the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople. What happens is D Company and D Company is left forward, C Company is right forward. A C Company actually has to go down and into a bowl and then come up to a piece of high ground. And on that high ground there's 4 German machine guns. So what D Company does is they move over to the west side of that bowl and they start laying fire down, support by fire positions, so that the C4ths can actually get through that bowl. And as they're walking through that bowl, they find lots of dead German soldiers from the artillery barrage that had happened just before. And then they get up over the lip and they attack those 4 machine gun nests at the top of the lip. But by the end of the day, they fall about 300 meters short of their objective, which is again the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople. And that's where things end on the 20th of December. On the morning of the 21st of December at 0700 hours, there's this huge explosion. What the Germans have done is that they have blown up the Cattedrale San Tommaso, the San Tommaso Cathedral at the north end of the town. And you can see it here. They've planted explosives in it. And this is particularly hurtful to the Ortonesi because the 21st of December is actually a big social event for the Ortonesi. It's actually the Feast of St. Thomas, where they celebrate St. Thomas himself, and now the Germans have actually destroyed his cathedral by planting demolitions in it. And Brad, there's a conspiracy theory out there that it was, Canadian artillery that came down and destroyed the cathedral itself. And I think that conspiracy theory is fueled by the fact that in the 1960s, there was an interview with Bertram Hofmeister in which he talks about where he saw a tower and he called artillery down on it. Yeah. And then they move to a shot of the Cattedrale San Tommaso, and so people make the mental leap that, oh, okay, that must have been the cathedral that he wanted destroyed. But it's way at the north end of the town, and it's not very visible from the south end of the town. So I doubt that Hoffy was able to call artillery fire. And when you look at that, Mark Zuelke, mentions it looks like a big cleaver has come down and cut the building in half. I'm sorry, artillery can't do it that cleanly. That's prepared demolitions. And so the Germans have destroyed the Cattedrale. And a painting from Charles Comfort on the left, and then a photo of it on the right. Okay, so on the morning after the Cattedrale is destroyed, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment now is fighting its way up Highway 16. Again, D Company is still on the left, B Company is still on the right. B Company has an easier go of it. They're actually able to break in and gain lodgment into the southern buildings of Ortona, but D Company, which is led by Major James Big Jim Stone, and the reason why he's called Big Jim is because he's a very tall, very stocky gentleman. He's also very temperamental. So Big Jim Stone, he tries to push his company forward, but they get cut down. He does 2 attacks. He starts his company with 90 soldiers, and he's down to about 30 soldiers by the time the second attack ends. He cannot get into the south end of Ortona. So he actually gets on the radio and he contacts Lieutenant Colonel Jim Jefferson, the commanding officer of the Loyal Eddies. He's like, sir, I want to take my company across Highway 16 and follow B Company in because they've broken in and gained lodgment in the south of the town. But Jim Jefferson's like, no, we have to keep Highway 16 clear. You've got to clear the left side of Highway 16. So no, you can't do that. So Big Jim's pretty upset that he can't, that Jim Jefferson's not allowed to do that. He's about to do a third attack when one of his platoon commanders, Lieutenant John Dugan, says, sir, why don't I take a small section of guys, about 8 to 10 guys. What I'll do is I'll infiltrate off to the west, and I'll come in from behind. I'll infiltrate into the town, and then I'll come into the Germans from behind. So Big Jim Stone says, off you go, do great things. And so John Dugan is actually able to do that. He has a section of 8 to 10 soldiers. They infiltrate into the town off to the west. They come in from behind, and they are able to get into the buildings and look down on top of the German positions in front of the buildings, and they're able to fire down and destroy those German positions. And that allows D Company to break in and gain lodgment on the west side of Highway 16 at the southern end of the town. Off on the east side of the town, the C4th Hunters of Canada, they advance the 300 meters forward, and C Company gets into the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople, and it's actually able to fight through the church. It takes a majority of the morning, but they're able to clear the church by around lunchtime or so. Now, the great thing about the Canadians here is that Major Tiger Welsh wants to get his anti-tank guns into the fight. It's a German paratrooper division, so they don't have tanks. But Tiger Welsh is like, why have my tank guns sit idle when, the Loyal Eddies and the C4s can actually use them? So what he does is he pushes his 6-pound anti-tank guns up to the Loyal Eddies and the C4s. And remember these huge rubble piles that are throughout the streets there, Brad? And they have booby traps and improvised explosive devices in them. So the Royal Canadian Artillery soldiers push their anti-tank guns up, and they start firing away at all these rubble piles to blow them down and destroy all the booby traps and the improvised explosive devices, and at the same time lower those piles down so that the tanks and the Three Rivers Regiment can look over the piles and start firing at German defensive positions. So I'm just going to pop out here, Brad, and go back to, there's a great shot here of the Loyal Eddies using their 6-pounder anti-tank gun here as an example of using it in against German defensive positions. Oh, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Yeah, great time for the commercial to come on. My apologies, folks. There we go. So there's the Loyal Eddies using the 6-pounder. So you can imagine the Royal Canadian Artillery lads using their 6-pounder guns for the same reason, just firing at German defense positions. You can imagine those shells striking those German defensive positions rather well.
Yep.
So good improvisation of the anti-tank guns. So this is what happens on the morning of the 21st of December. On the evening of the 21st of December, Jim Jefferson tells D Company to keep moving forward up the left side of Highway 16, and B Company to continue moving forward on the right side of Highway 16, which is now called Corso Bianchi. But Jim Jefferson's worried about his left flank, so he asks Hoffy if he can borrow a company from someone so that he can protect his left flank. So Hoffy turns to Major Sid Thompson, the commanding officer of the C4s, and he says, give a company to Jim Jefferson so he can use That company is left flank as he works his way up Highway 16. So Sid Thompson gives up D Company, and D Company goes off and becomes the left flank protection for the Loyal Eddies as they're working their way up to Corso Bianchi. Remember, Big Jim Stone was down to 30 soldiers, and B Company is also taking casualties as well. So Jim Jefferson actually disbands C Company, and he takes the troops from C Company and he puts them into A, B, and D companies to bring the numbers back up in those companies so that Jim Stone and the B Company commander can fight their troops forward as well. Meanwhile, the tanks are staying a little behind the soldiers, the dismounted engineers and the infantry, and they're putting fire down range on German positions. But what's happening here is Jim Jefferson's basically doing what in NATO and Canadian urban operations doctrine is called a thrust, where they're clearing the buildings en route. That's more time and resource intensive, but what it does is it makes sure that you've got the buildings cleared and nobody can sneak up on you from behind. So that's what they're doing. They're thrusting up the Corso Bianchi now. Off to the east, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. Once C Company has taken the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople, Major Sid Thompson pushes the rest of the battalion up. He's got D Company over the Loyal Eddies, but he pushes the rest of the battalion up. He pushes C Company forward by 200 or 300 meters to act as protection for the rest of the battalion. And then he safely puts his battalion inside the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople itself. And by the evening, that's where the Canadians rest. All right, some photos here from the battle. You can see the Loyal Eddies moving up. That top photo, the Loyal Eddies moving up on the 21st of December. And then a couple of days later, they're bringing prisoners of war back. Again, so it was so fantastic. There happened to be a Canadian Army film and photo unit with the Loyal Eddies and the Seaforths in this battle because they got lots of photos and videos as well. All right, 22nd of December. So the Loyal Eddies are now up at the Piazza Vittoria, and they start fighting their way in and around the Piazza Vittoria. The tanks come up from the Three Rivers Regiment and they enter the southern end of the piazza, and they just start firing at German positions, while the Loyal Eddies start working their way around the Piazza Vittoria itself. Once they get around to the north side of the piazza, Big Jim hops on the radio and he contacts Lieutenant Colonel Jefferson and he says, "Sir, I get it that we've been clearing buildings as we work our way up Highway 16 here, but what I want to do now is instead of clearing the buildings, I just want to have the tanks roll forward, blaring their horns as loud as possible. And I'm going to have the infantry and the engineers co-located with the tanks as they move up. And if any Germans pop out, they'll be able to, the dismounted infantry and engineers will be able to destroy those Germans. And I want to get up to the Piazza Municipale as quick as possible." Well, Colonel Jefferson's like, "Well, you're meeting my intent. So yeah, you can do that." So that's exactly what Big Jim does. He tells the tank troop that's located with D Company, he's like, "I want you to drive up Corso, now what is called Corso Vittorio Emanuele. And I want you to get up to the Piazza Municipale and blare your horns as loud as possible. And I'll have my infantry and engineers protect you." And that's exactly what happens. Now, the Germans, if they're in those buildings, they're doing one of two things. They're either like, "Uh-oh, the tanks and the infantry and the engineers are bypassing us, so we're going to be caught behind enemy lines," or the Germans are thinking, "Well, hey, this only gets the Canadians up to our main defensive area that much quicker." So what they do is they start withdrawing up the Corso Vittorio Emanuele on both sides and sucking back to the Piazza Municipale. The lead tank gets up to the Piazza Municipale, and there's this huge rubble pile. It's like 15 to 20 feet high. And the tank stops. And Big Jim Stone is like, "Why did the tank stop?" And so he runs up and he bangs on the tank with his rifle. And the crew commander pops his head out of the turret. And he's like, "Hey, why did you stop?" And the crew commander's like, "Well, I don't like the look of that piece of sheet metal there. There could be an anti-tank mine underneath of it." And Big Jim is like, "You got to keep moving. You got to get into the piazza. You got to get around the rubble pile into the piazza because we're going to lose momentum." And the tank commander's like, "These tanks cost $20,000 a piece. I'm not risking my tank because there could be an anti-tank mine there." And Big Jim Stone is like, "Each one of my soldiers is $1 million a piece, and you don't see me assuming that risk. Come on, let's go." At this point, the Germans realize the Canadians have stopped. And so they start taking fire now from the Piazza Municipale. And later on, Big Jim Stone goes and looks under that sheet metal, and there's no anti-tank mine there. But there's actually a series of anti-tank mines at the north end of the Piazza Municipale, which I'll talk about momentarily. Meanwhile, on the east side, the Seaforths are in the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople for the morning. And what happens is they start taking mortar rounds from somewhere. There's a German mortar position somewhere in the north end of the city. And what happens is there's an ammunition truck, and Major Sid Thompson's Jeep is literally parked beside the church. And the mortar rounds actually, the mortar rounds actually destroy those two vehicles. Huge explosion, and they destroy the ammunition truck. Sid Thompson runs out, gets into his Jeep, and actually drives it away so that it doesn't become a casualty. And then later on in the day, the Seaforths are able to locate that German mortar crew, and they're actually able to put fire down on it with artillery. So at this point, Hoffy says to Sid Thompson, I want you to move your battalion up to the Piazza Vittoria because I might need to get you into this fight. And so Sid Thompson moves his battalion up to Piazza Vittoria, and he occupies the Hotel Iris, which is a building that still stands today, and you're going to see a photo of it in a moment. And then he starts pushing D Company down the Via Rapino, which exits west out of Piazza Vittoria itself. All right. So this is the north side, the northeast corner of Piazza Vittoria. And this is the Hotel Iris, this large building that you see in all three of the photos. And Sid Thompson now has his observation post in the Hotel Iris. Now, if you look at the official history, if you read the official history there, Brad, Colonel Nicholson says these tanks right here are actually going north up the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. But that's not true. No. Like these tanks right here, if this is the northeast corner, you're looking west. This is the Via Rapino.
Yeah, it's west.
And this tank cannon is actually pointing its cannon north. This is the Corso Vittorio Emanuele just off to the right.
Yep.
These two soldiers you see on the right photo, they're running across the opening of the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. So it's one of those, corrections that I found in the official history.
Yeah, I know the direction because I almost got run over standing pretty much right where the second soldier is up there.
Oh, really?
The guy took the car it's a pedestrian walkway now. The guy parked his car right in the middle of it.
Right.
Didn't see me.
Okay, so. Brad, I'm starting to think that it's safer to be a soldier in Ortona in 1943 than you being a tourist in Ortona in 2024.
It was quite the day.
It was okay. All right.
And it was raining too. It was not great.
They're not great. Okay. So my good friend, Mark Pyrus, he's a open source intelligence analyst and an image analyst. And as you know, Brad, on X, I post every day an urban warfare historical photo of the day. And I posted this one. And what Mark likes to do, he calls my urban warfare historical photos of the day is crossword puzzles. Because what he likes to do is he likes to look at the photo and then he likes to try to find where the photo was taken and add satellite shots, additional historical information, et cetera, to the photo itself. So you can see what Mark has done here is he's got this tank on the left looking down the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, and he's got this tank here as it works its way down the Via Rapino. All right. So here's another great shot. I love this photo up in the top left corner. We're looking west down the Via Rapino. This tank, once again, pointing its cannon down the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. And these shots on the left, again, the Canadian Army Film and Photo Unit being there. Sergeant Johnny Marchand was a tank commander with the Three Rivers Regiment, and he made the mistake of sticking his body outside the top of the tank, and he was shot by a German marksman while the Loyal Eddies were fighting their way through the Piazza Vittoria. And so these bottom three photos here are Sergeant Marchand receiving his triage as a result of the injury itself. And once again, that film and photo unit, here we have the tanks. If another commercial pops on, I will not be very happy. Okay, there's the tanks. Yeah, look at that.
Yeah, I knew that was coming from
that thing. My apologies, folks. I had this all set up.
They load theirs up.
Yeah, there we go. So there's the tanks moving through the Piazza Vittoria. Good stuff. There's the Hotel Iris. So Sid Thompson's got his observation post up there right now. Fantastic stuff. And then they've also got there's a Sergeant Marchand's triage. They've got that on video, as well as they're taking care of Sergeant Marchand.
Yep. I did some now and then comparison photos with this whole area.
Same.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Okay, good stuff. All right. Here's Loyal Eddies and the Three Rivers. There's the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. And it looks almost pretty much the same as it does back then.
Yep.
Those buildings and those balconies there. And another shot, again, Mark's contribution to this particular photo. And then he did it also with this photo here as they're moving their way up the Corso Vittorio Emanuele towards the Piazza Municipale. He's actually put a thumbtack where where the photo was actually taken. So wonderful stuff, you know. And when guys like Mark do this, it's just a boon for historians, right? Because it just allows us to understand, you know, who was where and where they were located, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, thanks, Mark, for all the work you do there. All right, 22nd December. Remember, I told you that Big Jim Stone and the tanks are now up at the Piazza Municipale, and the tank commander is actually vindicated here because there are anti-tank landmines on the south side of that huge rubble pile. And Corporal George Campion is with the Royal Canadian Engineers. Very daring act. What he does is he throws out a bunch of smoke grenades. And then as the smoke billows up, he runs out with his engineers and he picks up these anti-tank mines. And now remember, they're anti-tank mines, which means you have to run over them in order to detonate them. So he's picking up the anti-tank mines and he's literally, you know, throwing them off to the side. And then the smoke would dissipate. The Germans see what he's doing, so they start firing at him. He runs off and under shelter, throws more smoke grenades out. And then he runs out and the smoke billows out. He runs out and he throws the anti-tank landmines off to the side again. He ends up winning a military medal for this as well. And the anti-tank gunners from the Royal Canadian Artillery, 90th Anti-Tank Battery, they're doing some great stuff as well. You can, as they're fighting, they're starting to evolve their tactics. So at first, what they were doing was they were putting anti-tank rounds in through the windows and doors and just having the rounds, you know, bounce around and spall. But what eventually they start doing is, while there's German positions on the second, third, and fourth floors of the buildings, they start running the anti-tank guns up piles of rubble, you know, improvised rubble ramps so that they can start firing at the top. And then what they also start doing is, well, okay, if the Germans are being really stubborn, we're gonna aim our anti-tank guns at the corners of the buildings, and we're gonna start striking the corners of the buildings. So this way, the entire building will just implode and crumble, and that will either destroy the German positions inside of it or force them to withdraw. Which is, you know, absolutely fantastic that the artillery and the Loyal Ladies anti-tank gunners are learning as they're fighting through this particular fight. Okay, it's on the evening of the 22nd of December when both Major General Chris Vokes, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division commander there on the left, and looking rather dashing in his ascot, and we have Brigadier Bert Hofmeister, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade commander on the right. They realize, oh my goodness, the Gustav line is not back by the Arieli River. Ortona is the eastern anchor point of the Gustav line, which is why the Germans are fighting so stubbornly and so hard within the town itself. And so what that forces, remember, they thought this was the Gustav line back by the Arieli River, right? But no, this is the Gustav line. And now Vokes and Hoffy are realizing that. So Vokes now, he was resting 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade and 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade. They were still in contact on the west side, but he was very much resting them now. But he realizes now that he has to commit 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade and 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade to the fighting west of the town in order to put pressure on the Germans inside the town. Because as you can see, if 1 CIB and 3 CIB can make their way up the west side of the ravine and get to the north end of the town, that will entrap and encircle the Germans inside the town, which will cut off their ability to sustain themselves. And that will make it easier for the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade. And at the same time, Hoffy realizes that he has to commit more resources too. It can no longer just be a Loyal Eddy fight. He's got to get the Seaforths right into this fight as well. So on the evening of the 22nd, Hoffy travels up to Sid Thompson's headquarters within the city at the Hotel Iris. And he says, Sid, I've got good news and I got bad news. Good news, I'm promoting you to Lieutenant Colonel and you'll now the official commanding officer of the Seaforths. The bad news is I've got to get you into this fight, but don't worry. I'm going to provide a lot of extra tanks and anti-tank guns from the Three Rivers Regiment and the 90th Anti-Tank Battery in particular. And I'm going to bring in 90th Anti-Tank Battery's J Troop, which is their 17-pounder guns, into this fight as well. So Hoffy is now realizing he has to commit more resources to this fight in order to clear the Germans out of the town itself. All right. So we'll start off with the Loyal Eddies. The anti-tank gunners prove themselves as really early morning alarm clocks, because at 5:30 in the morning, the anti-tank gunners set up just south of the rubble pile, and they start firing their 6-pounder anti-tank guns at the rubble pile and blowing it into the Piazza Municipale and destroying, not only reducing the rubble pile, but destroying all of the booby traps and improvised explosive devices within it. And then the Loyal Eddies start making their way around the buildings around the Piazza Municipale. But it's at this point where Captain Bill Longhurst, who's the officer commanding A Company, makes a smart tactical move. Now, remember, we're in Old Town now. Now, the buildings in Newtown were all very large and separated with very wide boulevards. So the Canadians had to go in through the doors and windows on the main floor and fight upwards. And of course, that gives the Germans the initiative because they always know how and where the Canadians are going to enter these buildings. And so they place their booby traps and improvise explosive devices, their riflemen and their machine guns, so that they can fire at the doors and the windows. But now we're in Old Town, where all the buildings stand shoulder to shoulder, literally touching each other. So Bill Longhurst is like, you know what? The Germans know we're coming in through the doors and windows on the main floor. But once we've cleared this first building, the Piazza Municipale, we're going to walk up to we're going to be at the top of the building. And then what I'll do is I'll have my engineers and my infantry pioneers, and infantry pioneers are infantry soldiers with basic demolition skills. And we're going to have them put explosives on the wall. And what they can do is they can blow a hole in the wall and then blow another hole into the building next door. And now we throw grenades in and shoot with our small arms into the hole. And now we've entered the building from the top. And now we can fight top down. And when you're fighting top down, things are a lot easier because gravity works for you. You can throw grenades down the stairs. A lot easier throwing grenades down the stairs than throwing them up the stairs and firing down the stairs. And so now that completely takes the initiative away from the Germans. So the engineers and the pioneers blow 2 holes. Bill Longhurst throws his company into that building. They fight top down. And then when they're done, they just walk up the stairs. And then they blow holes into the next building next door, and they fight top down again. And then they walk back up the stairs, blow holes, top down, and they just keep doing this to the buildings. Meanwhile, there's Germans on the other side of the street who are like, oh, wait a minute, the Canadians are getting past us now, and so they have to withdraw from the other side of the street. So the Canadians are now effectively clearing both sides of the street by clearing only one side of the street, although they will go through those buildings on the other side of the street anyway, just to make sure they're clear. So absolutely fantastic evolution of tactics on Bill Longhurst's part. Now, Brad, there's that urban legend out there, pun intended, that the Canadians invented mouse holing at Ortona. No. Mouse holing has been a part of urban warfare for decades, if not centuries. If you had a castle or a large building, and regardless if it was the 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries, plant explosives, blow holes through the building so you can enter them that way. So mouse holing is not a Canadian invention. It has been throughout urban warfare history for centuries. But it was the thing and the smart thing to do here at Ortona, and Bill Longhurst thought of it. And once he started doing it, the word got around, and the Seaforths start doing it as well as they're working their way towards the west side of the town. All right. Another development here is 90th Anti-Tank Battery sets up 2 of those 17-pounder anti-tank guns, and they're later joined by 3 tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment about 1,500 yards east or southeast of the town, where they have a clear shot over the Adriatic and where they can fire into the northern end of the town. And Brad, there is a video that shows them doing this.
Yes, there is.
Yeah. And it's very quick, though. You can see them here. It's only 3 seconds.
Yeah, there's not much.
Yeah, so here's the 17-pounder gun. There's the Adriatic, and you can see off in the distance, that hazy gray, that's actually the town itself as they're firing the 17-pounder.
Yeah, there's a little bit longer version, I think, showing the loading of the second round. I don't think it's fired. And then there's it's on the U.S. National Archive. And then the tanks are being resupplied with ammo.
Oh, really? Oh, I have not seen that video yet. So
I'm going to use it eventually.
Oh, good. Oh,
I was working on it today, but it's covering that whole area. But no, the tanks aren't shown to be fired. But there's a document that says it was 500 high explosive rounds are used by those 3 or 4 tanks in the course of the battle.
Right. Yeah. Well, they're just pounding the north end of the town, which is absolutely fantastic, right? Because that's only going to help the loyal eddies later on. And they're striking that northeast side along the Corso Umberto. There's, you see the tanks. There's a 17-pounder gun again, the photo of it in the bottom right corner. That's not at Ortona. That's a generic photo of a 17-pounder gun.
Yeah.
And then once again, I go to the wonderful Charles Comfort and his paintings, but you can see this is the Corso Umberto where those 17-pounder guns and those Three Rivers Regiment tanks were firing. You can see they've done quite a lot of damage on those guns. I will go back, though. Let's talk about the Seaforths. The Germans realize Lieutenant Colonel Thompson is up in the Hotel Iris because they start throwing artillery rounds down on the hotel. And so Sid Thompson's got to abandon his observation post, but he's got to fight his battalion, down the Via Rapino, and that's what he's doing here. But very tough going. There's like on this day, they only make like a couple hundred meters progress as they fight down the Via Rapino, and they're making their way up towards the Piazza San Francesco as a result. Okay, so remember, Brad, how I was talking about one of the challenges I found was historians not talking about cause and effect.
Yes.
Right. One of my research surprises. Well, on the evening of the 22nd, Vokes and Hoffy realize, this is the Gustav line. We've got to commit more resources. And so on the 23rd, you've got the Seaforths now committed to the fight, more tanks. You got the anti-tank guns, the 70-pounder tank guns. So the Germans realize that too. They're like, oh, okay, the Canadians have committed more resources, so we're going to commit more resources. So what the Germans do, remember, it's the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Parachute Regiment, which has been fighting the Loyal Eddies and the Seaforths. Now they commit the 2nd Battalion from the 4th Parachute Regiment to reinforce and co-locate with the other 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Parachute Regiment. So now, whereas the Canadians had this 2-to-1 advantage when it came to dismounted infantry only, now the Canadians, there's 2 battalions going up against 2 battalions, because now you have those 2 battalions of Germans in there. Not only that, but Adolf Hitler has heard about Ortona, and by this time, of course, he's micromanaging everything. And so he has told his subordinate commanders, Ortona will be held. And now, remember, the Seaforths are going to get up to Piazza San Francesco, and the Loyal Eddies are fighting their way through Piazza Municipale. This is the main defensive area. This is where the Germans are bound and determined to stop the Canadian advance. So the fighting now gets more intense and more violent as both sides commit more resources, and there's this cause and effect. Well, you're going to do this, I'm going to do this. You're going to do that, I'm going to do that. Right? So the other challenge that Jim Jefferson has is that he now has to split his Loyal Eddies up into 3 directions. I'm going to go back to the Map F4 program. And as we move up to Ortona here, I'm going to zoom down. There's the Piazza Municipale. But as you can see, the Piazza Municipale splits into 3 sides here when it goes north. There's this highway that goes up to the Piazza Plebiscita. And then you've got another road that comes up to the west side of Piazza San Tommaso. And then you've got 2 more roads coming up to the east side of Piazza San Francesco. So Jim Jefferson now has to split the Loyal Eddies in 3. He's got D Company, Major Big Jim Stone's D Company, moving up towards Piazza Plebiscita. He's got Bill Longhurst moving up his A Company up to the west side of Piazza San Tommaso. And he's got B Company trying to fight their way down this road to get up the Corso Umberto to try to get up to the east side, right? So now, and that's not ideal for the Loyal Eddies at all, to split up your forces like that. That's not ideal at all. Okay, so while Jefferson's having a tougher time at the Piazza Municipale, over the Piazza San Francesco, June Thomas is the commanding officer of A Company, and there's been so much German Canadian artillery falling down throughout the battle that when the Seaforths arrive at Piazza San Francesco, they look out and June Thomas sees a dead horse that's in the middle of the square that's been killed by artillery. And so he contacts Sid Thompson and says, I'm at Dead Horse Square. And this is why Piazza San Francesco is called Dead Horse Square. Now, what happens is this map in the top left, it's a digital map that actually somebody reproduced from the Reader's Digest 2-volume set on the Canadians in the Second World War. And Brad, this was another revelation. When you read the narrative that goes with this map in the top left corner, the narrative says that this is Piazza Municipale and this is the Loyal Eddies fighting, right? But this is not. Like, if you look at that layout, that's clearly Piazza San Francesco. And this is June Thomas, not a Loyal Edmonton platoon commander. This is June Thomas, a Seaforths Company commander, talking about how they fight through Piazza San Francesco. And so what happens is the Seaforths are able to get a section into the school that's on the east side of Dead Horse Square. And they do it rather easily. Like, the Germans haven't put up too much of a fight at all. And it's only a section, so 8 to 10 soldiers, but they're like, wow, that was really too easy. I mean, the Germans have been fighting really stubbornly throughout this whole fight. How could they let us come into this school so easily? Well, then a few minutes later, the entire building implodes because the Germans have set demolitions inside the building. And so the entire building implodes and kills all of the Seaforths except for one soldier, Private Gordon Curry Smith. The Seaforths see that the building implodes. They run out to try to start removing all the rubble from the school. And then suddenly the Germans counterattack. And this counterattack, Brad, is actually timed with another 1st Fallschirmjäger Division counterattack that's happening west of the city. So as they attack the C4th here in Piazza San Francesco, 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade is also getting attacked with this large counterattack. Now, this is something brand new. Usually, now we know that throughout the Great War and the Second World War, the German counterattack was like an SOP. But the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division never did counterattacks. Why? They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the supporting tanks or anything like that to do that. So they very rarely, if ever, did counterattacks. So this is the only counterattack that they really do while they're inside the city. So suddenly now, the C4s are thrown on a hasty defense as they're in these buildings marked A, B, and C. They're suddenly thrown on this hasty defense as the Germans flood out of the hospital and the church and run across Piazza San Francesco. And Sid Thompson is running around like a madman now, trying to coordinate his defense and cut down and stop this German counterattack. And they're able to do that. And then they continue to start building with the help of a tank. That's why that blue arrow is there. With the help of a tank comes up, they start firing at German positions inside the church and the hospital. But meanwhile, Private Gordon Curry Smith is the lone soldier who survived that implosion inside the school, and he's going to be buried there. He's going to be buried underneath that rubble for the next 3 days before the C4s can dig him out. All right, just want to check. Make sure, yeah, we're good to go. All right, 25th of December, it's Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day, and you would think there would be a lull in the battle. No, both sides are committed. And there's still very intense fighting and extreme violence on this day, despite the fact that it is Christmas Day. D Company, the Loyal Eddies, Big Jim Stone works his way up towards the Piazza Plebiscita, where once again, there's a very large rubble pile. And Bombardier William Doucette and Loyal Eddies, sorry, I should say Jim Stone is trying to get his troops around the rubble pile and into the buildings around Piazza Plebiscita, but it's too challenging. There's just too many German defensive positions. And so Bombardier William Doucette from the 9th Anti-Tank Battery very daringly pushes a 6-pounder anti-tank gun out into the open, where he starts firing rounds at the rubble pile to try to reduce it. And that allows the tanks from the Three Rivers Regiment to come up and start firing over the rubble pile and into the buildings. And Doucette starts firing at the buildings with a 6-pounder anti-tank gun itself. Meanwhile, there's German machine gun rounds landing all around him. He will end up winning a military medal for this. On top of that, and this was some of the new information that Lee discovered in the intelligence logs, is that the J Troop 17-pounder anti-tank guns, they're actually pushed up in through the up Highway 16, and they're brought up to the Piazza Plebiscita, where they start firing their rounds now around at German defensive positions around the piazza itself.
Wow.
Now, I had read in the resources that they had done that, but I couldn't ascertain from the resources where and when those 17-pounder anti-tank guns. So Lee's research there was able to find out that it was at the Piazza Plebiscita.
Wow. Okay.
That's
intense.
Yeah. The C4th Highlanders of Canada, they're still fighting at Dead Horse Square. And what they're able to do is they're able to bring up 8 tanks up to Dead Horse Square. And if you've been there, Brad, it's not a very large piazza, but somehow they're actually to get 8 tanks up. And all they're doing is firing all day at German defensive positions within the Piazza San Francesco. And that's I'm sure what happened was 4 tanks would go up, fire all their ammunition, and then they would be relieved in place by another 4 tanks, and they would fire all their ammunition. Meanwhile, those 4 tanks have been rebombed and resupplied, so they move up, and that's all they're doing all day.
I think that's the only way they would fit. I mean, it's funny because it's mostly a car park now because the school is still there.
Right.
So it's a pretty busy area. But yeah, the Via Rapino is still pretty busy. So I assume that's what they'd have to go all the way back to the main road because there's just nowhere room to move. Because when I first went there, I just sort of said, I know it's this direction. I'll just keep heading there. So it was pretty small roads. So I think that's a fair assumption that they would do 4 and 4 or some combo because there's just not enough room to move.
Yeah, same.
That wasn't today, but there's not enough room to move in that area.
Yeah, same.
Period at all. So.
Yeah. So it's Christmas Day. The Loyal Eddies, what happens is their regimental quartermaster Storman is able to bring up some, pork chops and a couple bottles of beer. And the Loyal Eddies are actually, they're able to take turns to suck back where they can wolf down, some cold pork chops, have a quick drink of beer, and then get back into the fight up at the Piazza Municipale. But the Seaforths do it with a little more style. So Captain D.B. Cameron is the regimental quartermaster for the Seaforths, and he approaches, Colonel Sid Thompson, says, "Sir, we've been fighting through this urban hell. I think I can put on, a pretty good Christmas dinner for our troops." And Sid Thompson's like, he's going to assume the risk. And he's like, "Yeah, let's do it. So what we'll do is on Christmas Day, we'll have Christmas dinner back at the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople. And what we'll do is we'll suck back one company at a time for 2 hours. So from 11 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night, each company will receive 2 hours to come back and, have a Christmas dinner and sing some Christmas carols, et cetera, et cetera. And just to give them a break from this urban hell that they've been fighting through up at Piazza San Francesco, up at Dead Horse Square. And very fortunately, Brad, there is a video of that as well, right? So, which is absolutely fantastic.
Allegedly, yes.
Allegedly. Oh, really? Oh, you found something different.
Yeah, that was the video. That was the video I was working on today.
Oh, really?
I'm working on that and looking at a few different things, and there's two theories that I found of what's going on there, and using pretty much the same pieces of evidence,
right,
to come to very different conclusions. So that's the video I'm hoping to get out.
Okay.
For my supporters very soon. Probably not tomorrow, but probably Friday. Yeah.
All right. There's the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople, and this is allegedly now.
Yes.
The Seaforths having that Christmas dinner.
Allegedly. It could be well behind the lines at first div.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. That's
well, you'll see in my presentation there, Wilf Gildersleeve was the signals officer for the Seaforths, and he was playing the organ as the Seaforths were singing Christmas carols during this particular supper. So what's interesting, Brad, is because you can see here that this young lady here, Karen Storwick, had done an investigation.
That's the one I'm using. Yeah.
Okay. And where she thought that she was able to verify that this was the Seaforths at an oratory outside of the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople. So I'm looking forward to your research and evidence.
Well, I know you can't see because you have to share on your screen, but British Muzzleloader's pretty well-known channel on YouTube here is doing the exact same kind of work I'm doing right now.
Oh, really? Okay, good.
He's having a bit upset in the sidebar.
Oh, okay. Well, no,
wants to talk to you, so we can.
This is the great thing about history, right? We always uncover new evidence and discover new things, right? And so if I'm wrong, I don't mind being corrected at all, because that's what history is all about.
I was literally halfway through working on it, and I went, "Oh, hold on."
All right.
So, yeah, I'm working on that, and we'll see. But yeah, there's some interesting things out there, and some other stuff I've looked at, and it's something I've been wanted to look at for a bit now, and I guess I'll have it out soon, I hope.
Okay, I look forward to new evidence. I look forward to the new evidence, and that's great.
Yeah.
That we can finally solve that mystery.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is Christmas Day, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Matthew Halton has been broadcasting about the Battle of Ortona. It's now international news. Due to the level of violence that's being committed by both sides, it's being compared to Stalingrad, that massive urban operations battle between the Germans and the Russians a year before on the Eastern Front. Well, somewhat humorously, Brad, if you read the Seaforths War Diaries, the War Diaries said this battle is being compared to Leningrad. So I guess, we can forgive the War Diaries for confusing his communist dictators. But yes, but as you can see here, Smiling Albert's having a discussion with 10th Army Commander General Joachim Lemelson. The information operations campaign is kicked into high overdrive. And now that Ortona is being compared to Stalingrad, there's a symbolic importance to it. Ortona has become the Italian Stalingrad. And of course, Stalingrad was such a huge political, symbolic and psychological loss for the Germans on the Eastern Front. And now can they afford to, lose yet another Stalingrad on the Italian, during the Italian campaign, even though it's considerably smaller, obviously. But so the Germans actually decide on Christmas Day that Ortona probably can't be held anymore. So they're going to have to withdraw from the city, because what they don't want to do is they don't want to lose 2 battalions of German paratroopers inside the town. If the Canadians, the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade and 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade, are able to flank the town to the west and north, they'll lose those 2 battalions. But they don't want the Canadians to know this, so what they start is a deception plan, which they call Operation Ortona. And what they do is they broadcast over the radio about how they're going to send more reinforcements into the town. They're going to provide more resources. They're going to have more close air support. We're definitely going to stop the Canadians at Ortona. We're going to up the level of violence in order to stop the Canadians. And this is all a deception plan to make the Canadians think the Germans are there to stay and they're going to fight it out to the very end, when in reality, they realize they're probably going to lose the town and they're going to withdraw from it anyway. All right. The 26th of December, the Loyal Eddies are fighting their way around the Piazza Plebiscita. They're able to get a tank into the piazza itself to fire positions. The Germans, and whether this is clever or stupid, I leave it up to you. But what they've done is they've actually taken one of their own anti-tank guns apart, and they've reassembled it on the second floor of a building to give them a better view. And they're actually able to destroy not only one Sherman tank, but a second Sherman tank that's in the piazza itself. So Big Jim Stone has to suck his company back and bring up more tanks and more anti-tank guns. And then he renews his attack in 1500 hours to start fighting through Piazza Plebiscita itself. Bill Longhurst is out at Piazza San Tommaso. He also loses a tank where a German, again, this is the problem with fighting in dense urban terrain, is that the Germans and the enemy can always sneak up using the houses, and they're able to throw an improvised explosive device down on another tank to destroy that particular tank out at Piazza San Tommaso. Out at Piazza San Francesco, the Seaforths lose two sections when they get taken prisoner as they're fighting their way in and around the piazza. Two sections get cut off and they're actually taken prisoner. And Sid Thompson wants to get those two sections back. So suddenly, there's just this tank fire, anti-tank gun fire. They're firing everything they've got at the German positions around because they want to save those two sections. There's only one German soldier guarding the two sections. And at one point, another German soldier comes in the room and says, "We need every rifle in this fight. Let these guys go." The German soldier says, "Promise that you won't fight us ever again." And the Canadians are like, "Yeah, sure." And then he disappears, and then they're able to retrieve those particular two sections, and they're actually able to clear Dead Horse Square. And B Company then starts moving up via Montemaiella, while A Company cuts back and starts clearing up via Cavour right here. Meanwhile, the 17-pounders and the Three Rivers Regiment guns tanks are still firing at the Corso Umberto, and B Company, who's sitting on the Corso Umberto, is just sitting back and watching all this fire occur in front of them, very happily paused while all this fire lands right in front of them to destroy those German defense positions. So this evening, General Vokes approaches Hoffy and says, "Bert, your brigade's taken a lot of casualties in this urban fight. What do you say? Do you think, do you want to withdraw from the city? And what I'll do is I'll try to force 1st Brigade and 3rd Brigade to move a little quicker up the west side of the city. And, maybe we can isolate the city that way." And Hoffy is like, "Absolutely not. Absolutely not. If I pull my brigade out right now, after the losses we've taken, the morale in this brigade will just lower and lower. It will just plummet. And my brigade will be completely useless for any future fighting at all, where the light is at the end of the tunnel. Like, we're just at the north end of the town. It'll probably take another day or two, but by God, we're in this to win it. And I will not withdraw from this fight at all." Now, Hoffy is pretty sure that if he had said to Vokes one way or the other, "Oh yeah, we should withdraw," or "No, we're going to fight," Vokes would have went with him. But Vokes said, "Okay, Bert, it's your brigade. If you think you can do it, then you get to finish the fight." All right, 27th of December is the last day of fighting in Ortona. The Loyal Eddies, now they've pushed through the Piazza Plebiscita. They're pushing up towards the Piazza San Tommaso. Remember, Bill Longhurst's platoon is on the west side, approaching Piazza San Tommaso. Lieutenant E.D. Bunny Allen, and I don't know why his nickname was Bunny, but he takes over the platoon on the evening of the 26th. And in the very early morning hours of the 27th, the building that the platoon is in completely implodes and buries the entire platoon and kills every one of those platoon members except for Lance Corporal Roy Boyd. And Bill Longhurst is livid. He just had a platoon buried underneath the rubble of this building. And so Bill Longhurst exacts revenge by doing the exact same thing to the Germans twice over. He's able to find two German defensive positions. He's able to sneak his engineers his supporting engineers and his pioneers into the basements of the buildings where they plant 4 to 25 pound explosive devices, and they destroy 2 buildings that the Germans are in. Like, this is how vindictive the fighting has now become. Meanwhile, the tanks are firing downrange, the anti-tank guns are firing, you've got artillery, German and Canadian artillery falling. Like, it's just non-stop violence throughout the entire day. By this time, by the end of the day, B Company is able to get up to the southeast corner of Piazza San Tommaso, and while they're not able to clear into it, they are able to set up positions where they're able to control fires into the piazza to deny the piazza to the Germans. And Jim Jefferson's also had enough. He drops 1,100 mortar rounds at the north end of Piazza San Tommaso, and the anti-tank guns and the tanks hear a rumor. The anti-tank guns and the tanks, they hear a rumor that there's some special gun inside the tunnel.
Right.
So they start firing at the tunnel now to make sure nothing can come out of that particular tunnel. On the west side, the C-Force are working their way up to Via Montemiela. D Company's on the northwest side of the street, and it's working its way up pretty well. But C Company on the southeast side of the street, it runs into a mill, and the Germans are being really stubborn. Inside this mill, the C-Force are able to get a platoon into the basement of the mill, but the Germans are being so stubborn that they can't fight up into it. So Sid Thompson's, he's had enough of it too. So he gets his engineers and infantry pioneers into the basement of that mill where they plant all kinds of explosive charges. He withdraws all of his C-Force, the engineers, and then they blow the building, and the building implodes and kills all the Germans. And then C Company continues their advance. And the C-Force are actually able to get up to the Via Montemiela, all the way up to the Piazza Plebiscita, where they're actually able to link up with the loyal eddies at the Piazza Plebiscita. All right, and there's Charles Comfort calls it the Piazza Plebiscito in his this painting, but you can see the amount of destruction that Piazza has suffered, according to Charles Comfort. All right, the 28th of December. So remember, the Germans had Operation Ortona. They put it out over the radio. We're going to apply more violence. We're going to stay, but in reality, they're going to withdraw. And in the early morning hours of the 28th December, while it's still nighttime, the Germans very quietly withdraw from the city. Once they're well north of the city, they get on some trucks, and then they drive back to the Riccio River. The Canadians, they start moving forward. The C-Force encounter some Ortonesi who've told them that the Germans have left. The loyal eddies are moving forward, and they're like, how come we're not taking any fire? Lieutenant Alan Johnson is the scout platoon commander. He moves forward to verify, and he runs into some Ortonesi, and they tell Lieutenant Johnson that the Germans have left. And somewhat humorously, there's a British Film Defense League documentary on the Battle of Ortona, and Lieutenant Johnson's talking in it, and he says the Ortonesi say to him, "We don't know what took you so long. There weren't very many Germans here." And Alan Johnson somewhat chuckles at that because it's been 8 days of very intense fighting as they've been fighting their way through the city. The Patricias now get into this because of Operation Ortona. If the Germans are going to stay, so Hoffy finally turns to Cammy Ware. And he says, Cammy, you're going to get your Patricias into this. I'm going to give you a B Squadron, Three Rivers Regiment. You're going to do a forward passage of lines through the C-Force and the Loyal Eddies, and you're going to destroy any German defensive positions at the north end of the town. Well, now we know the Germans have withdrawn. Hoffy commits the Patricias and the B Squadron anyway. They do a forward passage of lines, and they now start chasing the Germans north of the town up towards the Riccio River. And then, because now the Canadians possess the entirety of the town, Hoffy directs some air defense guns to be brought in. You can see that photo in the bottom right, which is actually fortuitous because the Germans do throw fighter bombers because they know the Canadians have the town now. So they actually throw fighter bombers into the town. And one of those air defense guns actually shoots down a German fighter bomber as it tries to bomb the Canadians in the town. All right, so post-battle events. Brad, out of the discussion of the battle, were there any questions there that popped up that you think should be answered now?
Saving them for the end, just little bits and pieces, things that I can't answer. So.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so post-battle events. Remember I told you Private Gordon Curry Smith was buried in the school at Dead Horse Square, and he was unburied 3 days later. Lance Corporal Roy Boyd from Wembley, Alberta, he's buried in the rubble at Piazza San Tommaso for 3 days as well. the loyal Eddies think that the whole platoon's been killed. Somehow Roy Boyd is able to squeak out that he's underneath the rubble. And so you see his two buddies here digging him out, and they are actually able to dig Roy Boyd out after 3 days of being buried in the rubble. And both Private Gordon Curry Smith and Lance Corporal Roy Boyd survived the battle and survived the war and returned to Canada, even though both of these gentlemen were buried in the rubble for 3 days. Absolutely amazing.
It's wild.
When I was doing my research and I was at Library Archives Canada there, Brad, and I opened the Loyal Edmonton War Diary, I found these two great sketches, which I had not seen in any other resource before. And what it is, it's the layout of the brigade in Ortona after the battle has happened. So the Loyal Eddies are located here. You can see their companies outlined in blue, and they've even got their platoon left and right of arcs of fire on there. And then the Patricias are up at Piazza San Tommaso, and the Seaforths were up by the northwest side of the town. And at some point they changed around, because you can see in this sketch, the Loyal Eddies are now at Piazza San Tommaso. But what an incredible find. And I was very happy to include that in my thesis, because I knew it wasn't in any other resource. So the Canadians and the Germans have been responsible for the destruction of the town of Ortona, but the Canadians do redeem themselves in the eyes of the Ortonesi by becoming friends with the local civilians and they start for several weeks, they start to rebuild the town. Just going to pop out here, Brad, to one of these other videos. This Canadian Army newsreel. I wonder what commercial we're going to see when I punch play here. So, oh, here we go. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Well, you can see the Ortonesi are now making their way. Remember, there was about 10,000 civilians in the town. About 9,000 of them were evicted. There's the Via Rapino. There's the Hotel Iris. Right there. Okay. Both during and after the battle, because there's all kinds of artillery rounds and explosives still all around the town. There's about, for several weeks after the battle, there's still civilians getting killed, unfortunately. So there are about 1,300 civilians will die as a result of the Ortona campaign, both west of the city and inside the city as well. But Ortona's turned into the 8th Army's Rest and Recreation Center for 4 months. And this is where I say the Canadians redeem themselves in the eyes of the Ortonesi, where they do all of these tasks. So the engineers and the pioneers, they start clearing unexploded ordnance, UXO, and they start verifying the strength of the structures, because so many artillery rounds and tank rounds and anti-tank rounds have been fired. They don't want the Ortonesi to move into the buildings and have the buildings collapse on them. So they start verifying, the strength of the structures. They're paying the civilians money for services. The civilians receive rations, water, livestock, medical aid, inoculations. And then in turn, they start giving language lessons and suppers and start hosting social events. The Canadians are clearing up houses, cleaning polluted water wells. There's bath and shower parades, film evenings. And inevitably, with Canadian soldiers, Brad, there is looting and drunkenness.
What?
So the military police actually have to arrest Canadians. And they actually use the castle up in the north end of the city.
That's right, they do. Yeah, I forgot about that part. I mean, it's a nice area now.
Yes. So anyway, of course, there's the funeral services afterwards. The Loyal Eddies in the top left and the Seaforths in the top right, and the Moore River Canadian War Cemetery is eventually founded. And I don't know what adventure you had that day, Brad, when you were
there. Couldn't make it.
When you didn't make it to the Moore River
Cemetery.
So,
I had to pick my battles.
Okay, so the Moore River Cemetery is just southeast of Ortona itself. I'm just going to pop off the graphic. Going to pop off the ground elevations. And it's located actually right here. As you can see, it's just a short drive away from Ortona itself.
Just a few minutes if you have a car.
If you have a car, but you can see the Loyal Eddies. There are 109 wounded, 63 killed. The Seaforth, 62 wounded and 41 killed. And the Three Rivers Regiment, for supporting the entire division, they had 20 wounded and 4 killed as a result. And the numbers for the 1st German Parachute Division are nebulous. Because most of the German records were destroyed during or after the war. And so these were the numbers that were the resources discussed within there. Now, the 205 missing in action, the Canadians found 100 dead German soldiers in Ortona. So I'm pretty sure that's probably, the numbers from the 205 missing in action there, because there's no way the Germans had to have suffered with 1st Brigade, 3rd Brigade fighting west and 2nd Brigade inside the town. There's probably more than 455 casualties. But anyway, all right. So Piazza Plebiscita has been renamed. It's called the Piazza degli Eroi Canadesi, or the Square of Canadian Heroes. And it's a square that's dedicated towards that is specifically about the Canadian sacrifice. And so here it is. We go back to the U.S. Army University Press documentary. And as you can see, there's the Piazza San Tommaso right there. And there's the various flags of the various nations. Oops, of course. I don't know why it's done that. My apologies.
I don't know why it's doing that. It's weird.
Yeah, best thing to do. Zoom out. Go back. This is why I put the times on the... There we go. So there's the Piazza San Tommaso, and there's the flags, and you can see what they've done is they've actually built a maple leaf into the ground itself, and just off to the left side, they have the statue of the Canadian soldiers. So this used to be Piazza Plebiscita, but it's now the Square of Canadian Heroes. Here's the Price of Peace Monument with a Canadian soldier helping his wounded buddy there. And this is really, this particular monument draws a lot of tourists now, in particular. And then
when I was there, was actually people just sitting in the park, which
really?
I did not see much else of the town when the weather wasn't the best. But
right.
And it's great.
See. And here's Moore River, Canadian War Cemetery. You can see Ortona off to the left, top left corner of the screen there. Cool, good stuff. All right. Conclusion. We'll wrap this up here, Brad. So some lessons learned. Again, I'm going to put my urban operations instructor hat on now. So some lessons learned from this battle. Intelligence preparation of the operational environment. Operational patterns cannot lead to dogmatic assumptions. Remember, British 8th Army has learned that the Germans will hold in a town or city for 24 to 48 hours, and then they'll pull back to the next natural obstacle that they've built human-made obstacles on, right? But then when it came to Ortona, they said the same thing. Oh, don't worry, Canadians. They're only going to hold it for 24 to 48 hours, and then they'll pull back, even though there were signs, indications that wasn't going to happen. But they just made that assumption, right? So when you're doing your intelligence preparation of the operational environment, don't just assume that the enemy is going to do the exact same thing they've been doing all along, because it didn't happen here. Okay, commanders and planners and urban warfare historians must be focused on the fighting both inside and outside of the city, because both influence each other, right? Remember I was talking about the Battle of Hue back on the 9th of November there, and how the fighting outside the city, it happens throughout urban warfare battles, where the fighting outside of the city will influence the fighting inside the city and vice versa. Vokes was not pushing 1st Brigade and 3rd Brigade very hard west of the city because he was trying to give them a break after the Mola River and the gully. But once they realized that Ortona was the eastern anchor point of the Gustav line, Vokes had to push for 1st Brigade and 3rd Brigade harder in order to try to isolate those two German battalions within the city. And once 1st Brigade and 3rd Brigade started making progress west of the city, that's when the Germans were like, okay, we definitely have to leave now because otherwise we're going to lose those two battalions. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Just the Loyal Eddies, the Loyal Eddies ammunition consumption alone was fairly intensive for these 8 days of fighting. And it's not only ammunition consumption, but there's also, if you don't have a good operational planning and or poor TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, you're going to have increased casualties. And usually you're going to have an increase in rations and water as well. So what I like to do, Brad, when I'm teaching urban operations, I like to say, okay, as a start state, do a good thorough intelligence preparation of the urban environment first. But as a start state, you're going to have to require 2.5 times the amount of food and water per soldier per day, because this is very hungry and thirsty work, because you got soldiers running across streets and up buildings and crawling through subterranean systems and boosting their bodies through doors and windows. Like normally our bodies use 2,000 calories a day just to do normal routine, but in urban operations, dismounted soldiers will use 5,000 calories a day.
Yeah.
So you've got to increase the rations and the water by 2.5 times,
right,
just so that your soldiers have the energy to do the urban fighting. 3 to 6 times the amount of casualties. plan for that. If you've got a good operational plan and good TTPs, you might not have 3 to 6 times the amount of casualties, but use it as a start status for a planning number. So that this way, if you do have a lot of casualties, you're prepared and you have the medical supplies and the medical personnel ready. And then 4 times the amount of ammunition, certain types of amount of ammunition. Use those as start states. You might need 6 times the amount of ammunition. You might need 8 times the amount of ammunition if you're going up really tall buildings or into subterranean systems, or depending on how the buildings are built and how much ammunition it takes to destroy them, right? So you've got to get your sustainment sorted out before you go into this urban battle. Okay, and as what I always like to say is, lots of ammunition, lots of ammo, grenades, ammo, water, ammo, grenades, water, ammo, grenades, water, and water. And don't forget the ammunition, don't forget the grenades, don't forget the water.
Yeah.
And then you'll be good to go.
Yep.
All right. Defenders have the initial advantage in urban operations because they know the town, they've got their defensive positions set up inside the town. But usually I find throughout urban warfare history, and Ortona included, that if you have a good if the attackers have good operational plan and good tactics, techniques, procedures, they will usually defeat the defenders. There's an urban legend out there, pun intended, that the defenders have the advantage. Well, throughout urban warfare history, the attackers usually win urban battles, sometimes at a high cost of resources, but they usually do. There's very, very few times where the defenders have actually won urban battles. And when they have won, it's because the attackers' operational plans and TTPs were so poor. Okay, you need to isolate the urban objective physically and or with firepower, using firepower to fill in the gaps that you can't fill in physically, and on the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, the Canadians didn't isolate Ortona at first, right, which allowed, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Parachute Regiment to be resupplied, and then they're actually able to, 2nd Battalion, the 4th Parachute Regiment was actually able to reinforce. If the Canadians had isolated Ortona and cut the Germans off inside the city, that would have been a very much a shorter battle. But because 1st Brigade and 3rd Brigade was not able to isolate the city quickly enough, the Germans were able to resupply and reinforce. And then when the Canadians threatened that isolation, that's when the Germans withdrew. So you have to isolate the urban objective. It doesn't matter if it's a platoon with a house, or a company with a building, or a battalion with a street, or a brigade with a small town, or a division with a large city. Isolate the urban objective physically and or with firepower and on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's an all arms, all components fight. There's an urban legend out there, pun intended. Urban operations, that's an army thing. And then within the army, urban operations, that's an infantry thing. No, it's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, if your country has them, and Special Operations Forces. It's logistics, it's electrical mechanical engineers, signals, medical, intelligence, military police. It's everybody. Everybody's got to get involved, right? The Army, for obvious reasons. The Navy, because, well, unless you're the mafia building Las Vegas, most cities are built on waterways and big bodies of water, right? So you're going to need the Navy. You're going to need Air Force because there's airspace over cities, right? You're going to need Special Operations Forces, right? So I'm not suggesting everybody has to become a subject matter expert in urban operations, but it's not just an infantry fight. It's everybody and their dog. Okay. I recently rewrote the Canadian Armed Forces Urban Operations Doctrinal publication. And I can tell you in chapter 6, I talk about everybody: Army, Navy, Air Force, Special Forces, logistics, electrical mechanical engineers, military police, everybody in that chapter, because I want everybody to know. If you didn't at this point. Yeah, I want. Yeah, thank you. I want everybody to know that they have a hand in this fight. They have to contribute to this fight.
Yeah.
Okay. The interesting use of weapons platforms and weapon systems. The anti-tank guns, right? Tiger Welsh was like, "Why have my anti-tank guns sit idle? There's German defensive positions there. Why don't I use my anti-tank guns to destroy them?" Right? The tankers, they learned very quickly. Okay, we'll fire high explosive rounds to create a hole in the building, and then we'll fire a frangible round to go through the same hole that will spall on the inside to kill Germans on the inside. The engineers started getting really creative with their explosives, right? Yeah. They would find German Teller anti-tank mines, start rigging up simple fuses to those, and start creating mouse holes, right? Sometimes they found if the Germans were being really stubborn, they would take 30 pounds of 808 plastic explosive, put it on a chair on the main floor of a building, light the fuse, and then run out. And then, 30 pounds of plastic explosive, there's not much left of a building really to clear. But still, like, the engineers got really inventive with their explosives, which is absolutely a necessity. You have to take, air defense guns, bring them into the fight. They got to be given the same protection like They got to be given the same protection from the infantry and the engineers and the artillery and the armor to make sure that the Germans or the bad guys can't come up and destroy them. But bring these weapon systems in the fight because they're needed. Tanks are a necessity. Another urban legend out there, pun intended. Oh, you can't bring tanks into an urban fight. That is garbage. That is junk. That is baloney. Okay. People keep saying you can't bring tanks into urban fight. They keep forgetting to tell the military historians, because there are dozens and dozens of urban warfare battles where tanks were used successfully. Right now, what I don't want to see, Brad, I don't want to see the tank taking the lead and the infantry and the engineers doing a conga line behind the tank as it rolls down. That's not a symbiotic relationship protection, because the bad guys can still come up and shoot at the tank and the dismounts behind the tank. So the engineers, the infantry and the engineers have to be ahead of the tanks, preferably clearing the buildings. I've been in front of a tank when it's fired as cannon. It's not very pleasant. So if they're in the buildings, clearing the buildings, then the tank can look down range and fire at other German fire at enemy defensive positions, while the dismounts in the buildings are making sure that the enemy can't sneak up and destroy the tanks. Right? It's this symbiotic relationship of protection. Right. And so if you got the infantry and the engineers protecting the artillery and the tanks and the artillery protecting the infantry and the engineers as they're working their way forward, absolutely fantastic. And the tanks are able to do that here at Ortona. And then finally, stay off the streets, because they are the killing zones. Use mouse holes, use subterranean, sub-T. But the ripple effects of that means you're going to need more resources. You're going to need more explosives to make mouse holes. You're going to need more tank ammunition to create mouse holes. You're going to need more equipment to start fighting through subterranean systems. Stay off the streets, because those are the killing zones. Start going through the buildings, because you're safer inside the buildings, that's for sure. All right, wrap up the conclusion here. So, Brad, the Germans had 5 advantages at the Battle of Ortona. The first one was they were paratroopers, and they're very determined, and they were good fighters. Lieutenant Hugh Pike was the 3rd Battalion commander of the Parachute Regiment during the Falkland Islands War. And Hugh Pike said, there's enormous residual self-confidence in a parachute battalion. People don't wonder if they could do things, right? And even Lieutenant R. McDougall of the Seaforths, he said, we saw a war movie depicting the Germans as barbaric fools, brutal and stupid. The boys who fought in Ortona don't take kindly to that sort of nonsense. So you even have Canadians who fought the Germans at Ortona saying these guys were good fighters. They were determined fighters who were committed to halting the Canadians inside the town. The second advantage they had was they had weeks and weeks and weeks of preparation. The Wehrmacht went in, they were rubbling all the buildings, they were putting all the explosive devices, they were bringing in all their bullets and beans and grenades and setting up all their defense positions. Weeks and weeks and weeks of preparation. The third thing, the geography. The fact that Ortona sits on a plateau. It can't be flanked by the west or the east. The Canadians have to fight up into it from the south. Dense urban terrain on top of that plateau. So the geography and the urban terrain gave that third advantage to the Germans. The fourth advantage, the element of surprise. They're only going to be there 24 to 48 hours. Oh shit. Yeah. This is the eastern anchor point of the Gustav line. They're here to stay. So there's that psychological element of surprise that the Canadians finally realized on the evening of the 22nd of December. And finally, the Germans only needed to commit small forces. Up in that tunnel in the north end of the town, they could keep safe there, and this way Canadian artillery couldn't fall on them there. And all they had to do was commit a company at a time to fight the Seaforths or the Loyal Eddies, and then they could rotate those companies in from the tunnel at the north end. And so they only had to commit small forces to the particular fight. So how did the Canadians win? What were the advantages that the Canadians brought? First, good combined arms training. That symbiotic relationship protection between the infantry engineers and the artillery and the tanks. Okay, good combined arms training. Okay, and that good combined arms use. Absolutely fantastic. Second, the improvisation of all those weapon systems, and the smart use of ammunition and the smart use of explosives. Number 3, the mouse holing technique. Again, not invented by the Canadians, but Bill Longhurst coming up with the technique, and then it getting passed on to all the Loyal Eddies and all the Seaforths involved in the fight, so that everybody started mouse holing. And the fourth advantage, finally, is grit and determination and just utter and pure rage on the behalf of the Canadians. The Canadians were so angry by the time they got up to the north end of the town that the Germans were being so stubborn in their defense and because they had lost so many casualties, that the Canadians were willing to up the level of violence exponentially until they defeated the Germans. And once we apply enough violence, we will finish this once and for all. And so it's this acceptance of the fact that they have to elevate the violence, and just becoming, and just like I said, this grit and determination and upping the level of violence, which finally allowed them to push the Germans out of Ortona itself. Brad, and that wraps up my presentation. If you can keep up my question period screen here, because I do have some resources to discuss and share with everybody like we did at the Way presentation, but I'll gladly take questions now.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one's a pretty specific question. I know you can't see it, so I'll read it out. But it's, excuse me, from the Great Dominion. Does Jayson know if Ortona was the first time the Western Allies encountered the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. The resources don't discuss those at all. I do recall. I recall one of the primary resources. It was one of the monthly reviews of the fighting did talk about some of the weapons that were being used at Ortona. I think the Panzerfaust was present, but I would have to verify. Yeah,
I mean, it's mentioned, like you said, because I just looked at one of the documents anyway. We were talking about the sidebar, one of the lessons learned documents. I think it's included in that one. I know there's mentions of flamethrowers being used, so I'm not sure if there was.
Oh yeah. There's a dismounted German with a flamethrower who appeared on the 24th of December in front of the Loyal Eddies.
Yeah.
And as soon as the Loyal Eddies saw him, every tank, every anti-tank gun, and every soldier started firing at him, because like nobody wants to die from flame.
Apparently he came back.
And he came back on the 26th.
Yeah, but I was ready to come back.
And the Loyal Eddies were actually able to destroy the building that he was in. Whether they actually killed him or not, I don't know, but they put enough firepower into that building to destroy it, because nobody wants to die from flame.
No, but yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to double check. But off the top of my head, it didn't stick out, but the flamethrower thing definitely stuck out. So yes. I'm not too sure. Sorry, just let me find it. Excuse me. So this one, you kind of touched on it, but I think this is kind of more directed. So from British muzzleloaders is, given Jayson's expertise with history, how do the lessons here translate into more modern, often, and sterile as in quotes, training in urban operations?
It's a two-part answer. Actually, after this battle ended, Canadian officers started touring the Allied lines to pass on the lessons learned from Ortona, because Brad, there's a figure out there: 40%, figures 40% of the fighting that occurred in the Second World War actually occurred in urban areas. The fighting now, because we're talking about the Italian front, again, because the Germans only held urban areas for 24 to 48 hours until we get to the Gustav line, there really wasn't that much dedication to learning about urban operations. If they're only going to be there 24 to 48 hours, why bother? But Ortona was really the first large urban battle that happened in the West. Now, I say large in the sense that it's the first committed long-term battle that happens for several days. Obviously it cannot compare to Stalingrad, which involves divisions and divisions. I mean, this is just a brigade going up against another brigade, right? So, but some of the lessons learned are passed on through the Allied lines by Canadian officers afterwards. And as a result, when they continue fighting up the Italian boot, and when they move into Normandy, even though there's a lot of new units fighting in Normandy and through Northwest Europe, some of those lessons learned are passed on there. Some of them are learned the hard way, as what happens when new units go into the fight. But those lessons learned are passed on. But as throughout military history, Brad, sometimes those lessons have to be retaught or relearned over and over again, right? And so, the Americans at the Battle of Seoul in Korea in 1950 relearned those lessons. The Americans at Battle of Hue, they relearn those lessons as well, right? And so throughout history, some of those lessons stick around, but some of them are forgotten, and they have to be relearned, in all honesty.
Yeah, I think it's a line in one of those documents, excuse me, about the lessons learned. It's basically saying the only way to do it is train really hard and focus on this in training, or just learn by doing.
Or learn by doing. And learning by doing is not the way you want to do it.
Particularly, no. And I think that was one of the lessons that stuck out to me, because again, I don't want to say it doesn't come up again, but there's limited. Again, maybe this is kind of question I had for you, if that's okay. excuse me, is excuse me, I'm dying here. Wayman, Brigadier Wayman, right? He is in charge of 1st Armored Brigade in Italy, and then is transferred to 2nd Armored Brigade Command. I was wondering if any of those lessons, like specifically armor, is transferred across from Italy to Normandy, because that's one of the few connections I can see that's being made through actual personnel being moved.
Right. I don't know if we're talking about specific units, I don't know, but I can tell you, I was talking about the Battle of Aachen with Paul Woodedge, Woody, there on WW2 TV back in October. And I can tell you that the 1st Infantry Division, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, they fought through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy. So, I mean, they've brought all those lessons with them. And so when they go into Aachen, they already know, okay, these are the proper tactics, techniques, and procedures that we have to do when it comes to fighting tanks in an urban environment. So I would suggest, even tankers will have learned these lessons as they fight their way through northern Italy and into Normandy and into Northwest Europe as well.
Yeah, because it's just a question I get often, right? Is how much is that knowledge being shared, right? Because that's the initial idea of even putting 1st Div into Italy in the first place, is to have them go through Sicily and come back to England with the lessons, which
pass on. Yeah, that's right. I'm not saying it's 100% successful. I'm pretty sure, like I said earlier, there are some units who had to learn by doing because they were not told, or this is the first time they're involved in an urban fight, so they learned the hard way. But I will suggest that there was an effort to pass those lessons on throughout the Allies because of Ortona.
It sounds like it's in a weird way, I guess, if you're not really connected in that, is it's learning across national lines, but not necessarily,
international lines. Yeah.
Or it's not moving through units within your own army, but it's teaching your allies. That's something I think to us, maybe as a civilian, it sounds strange to me, but okay. Well, just following up on that training question, actually, from British muzzleloaders here is, he goes, my point was that often there is emphasis on door kicking, in quotes, and room clearing kabuki, as this is a direct quote. The necessity of high levels of destruction, blowing up houses, etc., is often downplayed or left out. I assume that's meaning in terms of modern training doctrine.
Yes, I mean, that's the challenge that my urban operations brother from another mother, John Spencer, down in the United States, he's the chair of urban warfare studies, and he and I co-author a number of articles for the Modern Wars to West Point. But a lot of people, that's another urban legend, pun intended. Urban operations, it's all about clearing rooms. No, we've got enough people who know how to do that really well now. The challenge is the planning, the tactics, and the sustainment of urban operations at the company, battalion, brigade, division level. This is the gap that I've been trying to fill for the past 12 years.
Right.
And this is the gap that John and I want to fill. We've got enough people now who know how to clear rooms and walk down hallways. What we now have to do is get senior commanders and staff and very senior NCOs smart on the higher level planning, tactics, and sustainment. If you're only, like I tell my students, first of all, if you're only doing an infantry exercise with urban operations, you're failing. Like, get armor, engineers, artillery involved somehow. Second, if all you're doing is clearing rooms, you're failing, because Major What's-His-Pickle is not going to be clearing a room. Neither is Lieutenant Colonel What's-His-Pickle too. And so this is why I go across Canada and all over the world, because I am now focused on teaching senior officers and senior NCOs the higher planning, tactics, and sustainment at the company, battalion, brigade, division level. Once you've done both those things, then you're good to go. And I'll say this, Brad, the 48th Highlanders out of Toronto, they've had me come out for ex-Urban Falcon for 3 years. And what they do is they find a piece of subterranean subway system from the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, that's no longer used. And what they do is they have their privates to their sergeants do force-on-force training with simunition in the subterranean systems of that subway system. I have the warrant officers up to the majors, and I'm in the officers' mess, and I'm teaching the planning, tactics, sustainment at the higher level. The 48th Highlanders, they're setting the template. They've got it right. They're doing both, which is what you need to do.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, that makes sense of having the. Yeah, I don't always use the right terminologies, particularly the modern stuff. But I see those two levels, right? Like you just said, privates through to the lower NCOs, and then having those, quote unquote, higher levels of focusing on again, I've learned this from you, but focusing on those things to sustain and keeping it up with that, and it's just keep bringing up something again because I have a video coming out tomorrow from one of Matthew Halton's broadcasts. It's actually from the gully, but it's on I think it's on the 24th. So the fighting for the gully's over, but they're fixing the bridge that leads to Cedar Crossroads to keep that open.
Oh, okay.
So like that just keeps in mind. I'm like, well, Jason's like, this is how you're supposed to do it,
Right.
keep these things going. And it's just because it's an amazing clip because there's, firing going off literally in the background and you can hear them clang and the supports of the Bailey Bridge. Anyway, so it's reminding me of that. So it's just a fascinating way of keeping this stuff in mind. And I keep learning about all this stuff. So one question I think will probably be our last here is, I don't know if you know this battle much, but Great Dominion is asking what was done correctly in Ortona that wasn't done in, I hope I say this right, or Sakanago, the fight by the New Zealanders. I believe it's afterwards, north of Ortona.
Oh, Orsagna?
Orsaga, that's it.
Okay, I have no idea. I haven't studied Orsagna at all, so I can't answer that question, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. I can't remember the context of that one, but I heard it wasn't done well, so it must be an interesting one, maybe in the future. But yeah, other than that, I don't think we have any other questions. So
okay,
thanks a lot for coming back on.
Thank you. So the United States Army, you can still see my screen, right, Brad?
Yep.
Okay, the United States Army 40th Infantry Division, the California National Guard 40th Infantry Division, actually has an urban operations planners course, which I teach on. It's down in Los Angeles with my good friend John Spencer and many other urbanistas. And they have an urban operations electronics library. The course officer for the course was Brigadier General Robert Wooldridge before he retired just a few weeks back. And they had created this urban operations electronic library. And then when I started teaching on the course, he said, Jay, can you add to their library? So I dumped 20 years of resource collection and research into this urban operations electronics library. And I still maintain control of it. And I update it. I try to update it with the latest online articles and books that come out every 2 or 3 months. But if you want more on the Battle of Ortona, if you go to this website and go to the case studies individual and the case studies compilations tabs, you'll find more resources on the Battle of Ortona. My shameful self-promotion, once again, my thesis is online up in the top left corner. Urban Battlefields is available for sale. Lee Windsor and I have our chapter in that on Ortona. That led to the Mother of Tanks, two-part battle in which we talk about the fighting both inside and outside the city. The U.S. Army University Press in the bottom left corner very kindly had me involved in their documentary. And of course, Brad and I did that one 2 years ago. I mentioned, along with John Spencer, I co-author a number of articles and historical case studies for the Modern War Institute at West Point, Urban Warfare Project. And so we now have 10 case studies on there, including Ortona, which you see highlighted in red. And our one on the Battle of Aachen just got published yesterday.
Oh, awesome.
So yeah, so we've got a number of urban battles. And what happens, Brad, is that I will write these very fulsome chapters, which are dozens of pages long, with all the endnotes, et cetera, and then John and then our good friend Liam Collins and I will have to cut those chapters down to about 5,000 words, which is a constraint from the editor-in-chief of the Modern War Institute. And then we do an introduction and we talk about the battle, and then we add strategic, operational, tactical lessons learned from each battle, so that there's some analysis involved as well. And so please feel free to go to the Modern War Institute Urban Warfare Project to find our articles and case studies. This isn't the only battle I talk about. Obviously, Ortona with Brad. I mentioned Woody's WW2 TV. I talk about the Battle of Aachen, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Aachen there back in October. You can find on YouTube. For that U.S. Army 40th Infantry Division Urban Operations Planners course, I also talk about the Battle of Seoul, the Battle of Hue, which I did with Brad here on Saturday the 9th of November, just a few weeks back, and the Battle of Mosul, Iraq. And then I also talk about urban operations in the Russo-Ukrainian War and urban operations in the Israeli-Hamas conflict. And I've given all of these presentations dozens of times now to military units and civilians all over the world. When it comes to the bottom presentation, Russo-Ukrainian War and Israeli-Hamas conflict, I can only talk about Israeli-Hamas to military personnel because of our government stance on that particular conflict. But those are other urban battles that I talk about quite extensively. And then finally, I'm on X, and 90% of the stuff I put on there is urban operations, urban warfare, 5% is military history, and 5% Go Ukraine. So those are my shameful self promotions there, Brad. And
All right.
that ends my presentation.
Hey, no problem with that at all. So just quickly, British Muzzleloaders is asking best way to contact you. Would that be through X, or is there another way? That's good.
Yeah, through X certainly through X is certainly a way to do it. You can either DM me and then I'll respond, because I monitor that pretty regularly.
Okay. Yeah. And if not, maybe I can get in touch privately.
Certainly.
With not on a public forum. Anyway, yeah. So thanks again, Jayson. It's always great to have you on. We'll have you on again because I want to talk about those other ones, because I can have you cover everything, and I know I'll enjoy it. So
thank you.
Shamelessly and selfishly want to have you back on to talk about these things, because they're fascinating to me, and it's bringing back the interest I did have of urban operations when I really first started doing history. I don't paying attention, particularly when I started my undergrad forever ago now. So it's nice to have that coming back and everything, and having your mind in a good way in the back of my head, being like, don't forget this, don't forget that.
All good. And I tell you, I'm looking forward to your videos and your research, because that's the great thing about history, is that new evidence is always being uncovered. And if you've got more on Ortona or British muzzleloaders, or I'm very open to ripping my thesis apart.
Well, every historian should be.
Yes.
That's the way it should be done.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right, everyone, thanks for hanging out with us this evening. I'm sure it's late for some of you, so if you're really late, head to bed. Others, we'll see you again soon. I might be doing some stuff before the holidays, not sure. But I'll keep everybody updated as best I can. So other than that, everyone have a good night, and I'll see you next time.
Have a good night, everybody. Thank you very much.